The court convenes a philosophical trial in which you are the only witness. Dr. Rick Novak. The court convenes a philosophical trial in which you are the only witness. Rick Novak. Wolf Publishing, New Canaan, Connecticut. Dedication to my mother. You taught me long before I understood the lesson that character is built one choice at a time. You showed me that strength and kindness are not opposites, that integrity matters when no one is watching, and that love is measured not by words alone, but by the life that stands behind them. When I was uncertain, you offered direction. When I was lost, you provided a compass. When the path ahead was unclear, you reminded me, by example, that becoming the person we hope to be is the work of a lifetime. This book, which asks what kind of person we are becoming, owes more to your influence than these words can adequately express. With gratitude, respect, and love. And to the men who have chosen to sit in the witness chair, I have had the privilege of walking beside many of you as you wrestled with difficult questions, confronted uncomfortable truths, challenged old assumptions, and undertook the demanding work of honest self-examination. You taught me that change is rarely dramatic. More often, it is quiet. It is found in accountability accepted, habits reconsidered, apologies offered, values clarified, and choices made differently than they were made before. This book is dedicated to your courage, not the courage of certainty, but the courage of examination. Not the courage of having all the answers, but the courage to keep asking the questions. May you never stop becoming. Dr. Rick Novak. In life's journey, I have become more aware of the horizon. Horizons are funny things. When we are young, we think we are approaching the edge of knowledge. When we are older, we realize the horizon keeps moving. The mystery grows larger, not smaller. Rick Novak, Imparo Ancora, I am still learning, attributed to Michelangelo prologue, The Court Convenes. Why are you here? You did not choose to be here. Nobody does. You arrived the way most men arrive at the important moments of their lives, without a map, without a warning, and without a clear understanding of what is being asked of you. You walked through a door that looked ordinary enough from the outside, and now you are standing in a room that feels like nothing you expected. It is a courtroom, but not the kind you have seen before. There is no jury. There is no prosecutor. There is no crowd of spectators leaning forward to watch you sweat. There is no charge posted on the wall, no indictment folded in a clerk's hands, no gallery of people who have already decided what they think of you. There is only a bench, a chair, a room that is quieter than it should be, and a question that has been waiting for you longer than you know. The judge does not look at you with contempt. He does not look at you with pity either. He looks at you the way a man looks at another man when he already understands something about what the other man is carrying, and he is not in a hurry, and he is not going anywhere. He says this court exists for one purpose, not to punish you, not to shame you, not to reduce you to the worst thing you have ever done, or the best thing you have always wished someone would notice. This court exists to ask you who you are becoming. You sit down. Maybe you already feel the discomfort of that word, becoming. It implies that whatever you are right now is not finished. It implies that the story is still being written. For some men, that is a relief. For others, it is the most unsettling thing they have heard in years, because it means the choices are not behind them. They are still ahead. The witnesses who will appear in this room come from across centuries and across traditions. Some of them will say things that feel immediately true. Others will say things that make you want to argue. You are allowed to argue. In fact, the arguing is part of it. A man who moves through these pages without resistance is probably not reading carefully enough. What is not allowed is the comfortable distance of deciding that any of this is meant for someone else. It is not meant for someone else. There is no one else in this room. There will be no verdict rendered here. The court does not work that way. What will happen instead is that questions will be placed in front of you, one at a time, by men who spent their lives refusing to look away from hard things. They will not tell you what to believe. They will not hand you a rubric or a scorecard or a list of the 10 things a good man does before breakfast. They will simply ask you to look, honestly, at the life you are living and the man you are in the process of becoming. That is the whole of it. Some of the questions will be ones you have avoided for a long time. You will recognize them by the faint sensation of wanting to skip ahead. Don't. The thing you want to skip is usually the thing that brought you here. Before the first witness enters, the court asks that you consider one thing. How do you define strength in a man? Not in the abstract, in the specific. When you picture a strong man, what does he look like? What does he do with difficulty? What does he do with fear? What does he do with the people who need something from him that he does not know how to give? Where did that definition come from? Did you construct it yourself through examination and deliberate choice? Or did it arrive fully formed, handed to you by someone else before you were old enough to evaluate what you were receiving? Who taught you that a particular feeling was weakness? Who taught you that a particular behavior was strength? What has that definition cost you? Not in the dramatic sense, in the daily, unremarkable, accumulated sense of a man who has been living inside a definition for decades without ever holding it up to the light and asking whether it is actually true. Most men, when asked to define strength honestly, produce a definition that closely resembles the one they inherited. Different words, perhaps, but the same shape, the same permissions and the same prohibitions, recognizable because they were already present, already in operation, long before the man in question was old enough to have chosen them. The court is interested in whether you have ever examined that definition or whether you have simply lived inside it. The first witness is about to enter. The court is now in session. Chapter 1. The Question of Truth. How do you know you are right? The first witness enters without ceremony. No robes, no laurels, no monuments to his greatness carried in ahead of him. He is shorter than you expected, broad through the chest, with a face that history has never been particularly kind about describing. He looks like a man who has spent a great deal of time outdoors and not much time worrying about the impression he makes when he walks into a room. He takes the witness chair and looks at you directly. This is the thing people who have read about Socrates tend to forget. He was not a gentle presence. He was not a warm professor with patches on his elbows who made you feel good about asking questions. He was the man the city of Athens eventually decided it could not tolerate anymore. They gave him a choice between exile and death, and he chose death because he refused to stop doing the one thing that made them uncomfortable. He asked questions, not polite questions, not questions designed to arrive at a predetermined answer, questions that had a way of revealing that the person being asked did not actually know what they were certain they knew. Questions that peeled back the confidence a man carries in public and showed him what was underneath. He called it the examined life. He said a life without examination was not worth living. That is one of the most repeated lines in all of philosophy, and because it has been repeated so many times, it has lost some of its edge. So let it land again for a moment. A life without examination is not worth living. He was not talking about therapy. He was not talking about journaling or mindfulness or any of the vocabulary that surrounds self-reflection today. He was talking about something more fundamental and more demanding. He was talking about the willingness to ask yourself, seriously and without flinching, whether what you believe is actually true. Most men never do this, not because they are lazy or dishonest, but because certainty is comfortable, and comfort is hard to give up voluntarily. You probably know a man who is always right. Maybe you have been that man at certain points in your life. Most of us have. He is the man in the room who speaks with the kind of confidence that does not leave much space for another perspective. He has an answer before the question is fully formed. He has seen this before. He knows how it ends. He is not asking because he is genuinely curious about what you think. He is waiting for you to finish so he can explain why he is correct. That man is not as strong as he appears. What looks like certainty from the outside is very often something else on the inside. It is the architecture a man builds around the things he cannot afford to question, the beliefs that are so load-bearing, so fundamental to how he understands himself and his life, that he has decided unconsciously that they simply cannot be examined. To question them would be to risk too much. So instead he defends them. He argues louder. He mistakes volume for truth and repetition for proof. Socrates had a word for this. He called it false knowledge. The most dangerous kind of ignorance is not the ignorance of a man who knows he does not know something. That man can learn. The most dangerous kind of ignorance is the ignorance of a man who is absolutely certain he already knows, and therefore stops looking. To understand what Socrates actually did, you have to picture Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era. Not the Athens of marble columns and tourist photographs. The living city. Crowded, loud, argumentative, full of merchants and soldiers and politicians and tradesmen all moving through the same narrow streets. A city that took ideas seriously in the way that cities sometimes do when they are at the height of their confidence, when they believe they are the center of the world and that the questions worth asking are being asked right here. Into that city, Socrates walked every day without a school, without a salary, without a written word to his name. He owned almost nothing. He wrote nothing down. Everything we know about him comes through the accounts of the men who followed him, Plato most prominently, who spent his life trying to capture on paper what it felt like to be in a conversation with this man. What it felt like, by most accounts, was unsettling. Socrates had a method. It came to be called the elenchus, which is the Greek word for cross-examination. He would approach a man who had a reputation for knowing something, a general who was known for his courage, a statesman who was known for his wisdom, a poet who was known for his insight, and he would ask that man to define the thing he was known for. What is courage? What is wisdom? What is justice? The man would answer. Of course he would answer. He had spent his life being recognized for the very thing being asked about. He knew the answer the way he knew his own name. And then Socrates would ask a follow-up question. Not a hostile question, not a trap, exactly, though it would come to feel like one. A genuine question that followed naturally from the answer just given. Something like, if courage is what you say it is, then how do we account for this? And he would offer an example, a case, a scenario that did not quite fit the definition the man had provided. The man would refine his answer. Socrates would ask another question. The man would refine again and again and again, until the definition that had felt so solid at the beginning of the conversation had been turned over enough times that neither man could find a side of it that held its shape completely. Until the general, who had spent 30 years being courageous, could not produce a definition of courage that survived 10 minutes of careful questioning. That moment, the moment when the confident man discovered the limits of his own understanding, Socrates called aporia. It is a Greek word that means, roughly, without a path. The state of being genuinely lost in a question you thought you had already answered. Most of the men Socrates brought to aporia were furious. A few of them were grateful. The difference between those two responses is worth examining because it shows up in every man's life in one form or another. When someone or something reveals to you that what you were certain of is less solid than you believed, what do you do with that? Do you defend the certainty more aggressively? Do you find a reason to dismiss the source? Or do you sit with the discomfort long enough to let it teach you something? Socrates believed that aporia was not the end of thinking. It was the beginning of it. A man who has been brought honestly to the edge of what he knows, and who can tolerate standing there without immediately retreating into false certainty, is a man who is finally in a position to learn something real. The men who became his enemies could not tolerate the edge. The men who became his students learned to live there. There is a dialogue Plato wrote called the Meno. In it, Socrates is asked whether virtue can be taught. It is a reasonable question, the kind of question that educated Athenians discuss the way educated people today discuss politics or culture. Socrates begins asking questions, as he always does. What is virtue? Meno answers confidently. Socrates asks a follow-up. Meno refines his answer. Socrates asks another question. By the middle of the dialogue, Meno is exasperated. He says to Socrates, "Before I met you, I had heard that you were a man who created confusion and doubt in everyone around you, and now I see it is true. You have made me unable to answer a question I have answered many times before. You are like a torpedo fish that numbs everything it touches." Socrates responds that if he is a torpedo fish, He numbs others only because he is numb himself. He is not pretending to have answers he does not have. He is genuinely uncertain, and he would rather be genuinely uncertain than falsely confident. That response is one of the most important things Socrates ever said, and it tends to get less attention than it deserves. He was not performing humility. He was not being strategically modest in the way that some people deploy modesty as a social tool. He genuinely believed that the honest acknowledgement of his own ignorance was not a weakness, but the only intellectually defensible position available to him. He had looked carefully at the things men claimed to know, and he had found every time that the knowledge was thinner than it appeared. Not worthless, not entirely wrong, but thinner, more conditional, more dependent on assumptions that had never been examined than the confident men who held those beliefs would ever voluntarily admit. He called this his one advantage. He knew that he did not know. Most men did not even have that. Consider what it would mean to apply that standard honestly to your own life, not to your opinions about politics or history or the behavior of people you have never met. Those are easy things to hold loosely because they cost you nothing to revise. Consider instead the beliefs you hold about the things closest to you. What you believe about why your most important relationships have gone the way they have gone. What you believe about what you deserved and did not receive, or what others deserved and did not receive from you. What you believe about your own character, the kind of man you are under pressure, the kind of man you are when you are frightened or ashamed or backed into a corner. What you believe about your own past, the story you have assembled from the raw material of everything that happened to you, and whether that story would survive the kind of questioning Socrates brought to the generals and the poets and the statesmen of Athens. That examination is what this chapter is asking of you. Not as an intellectual exercise, as a practice, as something a man does not once, in a moment of crisis or clarity, but continuously, as a discipline, the way Socrates walked into the agora every single day, not because he expected to find answers, but because he believed the questioning itself was the work. The first witness has stepped down, something worth sitting with, in the space between his leaving and the next witness arriving, is whether you felt yourself defending anything while he spoke. Whether there was a moment in his testimony where you felt the specific interior motion of a man who has just been told something true and is already constructing the reasons it does not quite apply to him. Most men feel it. The defense is not dishonest. It is simply the mind protecting what it has built. The question is whether you noticed it. The second witness is going to ask about the lens through which you see. He is going to suggest that what you believe to be reality is, in significant ways, a construction. Before he enters, consider what the first witness prepared you for. You have just heard testimony about the danger of false certainty, about the man who stops looking because he already believes he knows. The second witness is going to ask whether some of what you see most clearly is not the world, but the window. Before he enters, consider this. What is the story you tell most often about your own life? Not the most dramatic one. Not the one you would tell at a dinner table to make people understand something about where you came from. The one you tell yourself. The one that runs quietly in the background of your thinking. The one that explains the distance between what you hoped for and what actually happened. Who is the hero of that story? Who is responsible for the difficulty in it? Is there a version in which you bear more responsibility than the current version assigns to you? Is there a version in which the person you have cast as the obstacle was, in their own story, simply trying to survive something you did not fully see? The stories a man tells most often are almost never neutral. They protect something. They explain something that would otherwise require a more difficult accounting. The second witness is about to ask what you would see if you turned around and looked at the wall behind you rather than the shadows it casts in front of you. The second witness enters. The question of reality. Are you seeing reality or your interpretation of reality? The second witness enters differently than the first. Where Socrates moved like a man unbothered by what anyone thought of him, Plato carries something more deliberate. He was an aristocrat by birth, broad-shouldered, which is reportedly how he got the name, and he had the bearing of a man who had spent his life thinking carefully before he spoke. He studied under Socrates for nearly a decade. He was there at the trial. He was there, or close enough to there, at the end. He spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of what the death of that man meant, and in doing so he built one of the most consequential philosophical systems the world has ever seen. He takes the witness chair and says nothing for a moment. Then he asks, "What do you think you are looking at?" He does not mean the courtroom. He means everything. He means the life you have assembled from the raw material of your experience, the people in it, the events that shaped it, the meaning you have attached to all of it. He means the story that feels so obviously and self-evidently true that you have stopped noticing it is a story at all. What do you think you are looking at? And how certain are you that what you are seeing is actually there? Plato wrote a parable that has survived 2,500 years because it describes something so precisely true about human experience that each generation rediscovers it as if it were new. He asks you to imagine a cave. Inside the cave there are prisoners. They have been there since birth. They are chained in such a way that they can only face the cave wall in front of them. Behind them, at a distance, a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, people move and carry objects, and the shadows of those objects fall on the wall the prisoners are facing. The prisoners have never seen anything else. They have spent their entire lives watching shadows move across a wall, and they have become expert at it. They can predict which shadow comes next. They can name the shapes. They have built an entire vocabulary around the shadow world, a shared understanding, a consensus reality, and it feels to them not like shadows, but like the world itself, because it is the only world they have ever known. Now imagine that one prisoner is unchained. He turns around. The fire blinds him at first. Everything is painful and disorienting. The shapes he can now see, the actual objects that cast the shadows he spent his life studying, do not look like what he expected. They are more complex, more dimensional, less predictable than their shadows were. He stumbles. He wants to turn back. The shadows were at least familiar, but someone leads him further, out of the cave entirely, into sunlight. The sunlight is almost unbearable. He cannot see anything at first. Slowly his eyes adjust, and he begins to see the world as it actually is, not as shadows on a wall, not as shapes in firelight, but in full dimension and full color, with a clarity he had no framework to imagine when he was chained to the cave wall. Plato calls this the allegory of the cave. The shadows are the world as most men experience it. Not false exactly, but incomplete, a projection, a reduction of something more complex and more real than the version they have been given, or given themselves, or inherited from the people who chained them there before they were old enough to know what was happening. The question Plato is asking you, sitting here in this courtroom, is not a comfortable one. Which parts of your life are you still watching as shadows? Most men do not experience reality directly. They experience their interpretation of reality, and they experience it so consistently, so fluently, and with such a strong sense of its self-evidence that the distinction between the two collapses entirely. The interpretation becomes invisible. It stops being something you are doing and starts being something that simply is. Two men can sit in the same room, witness the same conversation, and walk away with entirely different accounts of what happened. Not because one of them is lying, not because one of them is more intelligent or more observant than the other, but because each of them filtered what they saw through a different set of assumptions, experiences, and prior conclusions, and those filters shaped what they noticed, what they retained, and what meaning they assigned to it. That gap between what happened and what a man believes happened is one of the most consequential distances in a human life. It is the distance in which most arguments live. It is the distance between a man who believes he is being criticized and a man who is simply being questioned. It is the distance between a man who hears his son's silence as indifference and the father who never considered that the silence might be something else entirely. It is the distance between the man who is certain he knows what his partner meant by that tone of voice and the possibility that he has been wrong about that particular tone of voice for years, and that nobody has ever successfully told him so, because the certainty he carries about it forecloses the conversation before it can begin. Plato would say that the chains in the cave are not always put there by other people. Sometimes a man chains himself. There is a word in philosophy for the lens through which a person perceives and interprets experience. It is sometimes called a schema, sometimes a frame, sometimes simply a worldview. The terminology varies depending on who is doing the talking. What does not vary is the underlying reality it is describing, which is this. Every human being approaches experience with a set of pre-existing structures assembled from everything that has happened to them before this moment. And those structures determine not just what a man concludes about what he sees, but what he is capable of seeing in the first place. This is not a flaw in human cognition. It is an inevitability of it. A man cannot perceive the world without a brain, and a brain cannot process experience without structure. The question is not whether you have a lens. You do. Everyone does. The question is whether you know it is there. The man who knows his lens is there can hold it at enough distance to occasionally ask whether it is distorting what he is looking at. He can notice when his interpretation of an event feels suspicious, too neat, too consistent with what he already believed, too convenient. He can ask whether the meaning he is assigning to something is coming from the situation in front of him or from the accumulated weight of every situation that came before. The man who does not know his lens is there cannot do any of that. He is still in the cave, watching shadows, certain he is watching the world. What built the lens matters. A man who grew up in a household where anger was the primary language of authority will have developed a lens calibrated to detect anger, to anticipate it, to interpret ambiguous signals in its direction. He will read a neutral face as hostile. He will experience a raised voice as a threat, even when no threat is intended. He will organize his responses around a danger that exists in the lens more fully than it exists in the room. He is not inventing the danger. He is retrieving it from a past that is no longer present, but that continues to shape perception as though it were. That is the cave, not a metaphor for ignorance in the abstract. A description of a very specific and very common human experience, the experience of moving through a present life while perceiving it through the filters of a past one. The lens is built early, long before a man has the vocabulary to name what is happening to him. He is learning how the world works, not from books or instruction, but from observation, from the accumulated evidence of what people around him do when they are frightened, when they are angry, when they are loving, when they are ashamed, from what was rewarded and what was punished, from what was spoken and what was never spoken, but was present in every room regardless. A boy watches his father. He watches how the man moves through the world, how he handles difficulty, how he responds to failure, what he does with tenderness, whether tenderness is something that exists in the household at all. He watches what his father respects and what he dismisses. He watches what makes his father proud and what produces that particular silence that is somehow worse than anger. And from all of that watching, largely without knowing he is doing it, he begins to construct a template. This is what a man is. This is what the world expects of a man. This is what safety looks like. And this is what threat looks like. And this is the distance you keep. And this is what you never show. And this is the thing you always defend. That template is not the truth about manhood. It is one man's lived experience of one version of manhood, filtered through his own fears and limitations, and the templates he inherited from the men who came before him. But it arrives in a child's mind with the authority of revelation, because children do not yet have the cognitive architecture to hold their observations at a critical distance. They absorb, they conclude, they encode, and then they spend the rest of their lives perceiving the world through what they encoded. Consider what this means for the way a man interprets conflict. Most men have a pattern, not a chosen pattern, an automatic one, something that activates before conscious thought has a chance to intervene and ask whether this situation actually calls for this response. For some men, the pattern is to advance, to meet conflict with force, with volume, with the kind of certainty that is designed to end the argument rather than resolve it. That pattern was built somewhere. In a household where the man who got loud got his way. In a schoolyard where backing down had consequences. In a decade of experience that taught a particular boy that the way to survive conflict was to win it. For other men, the pattern is to withdraw, to go silent, to leave the room physically or emotionally and wait for the weather to change. That pattern was also built somewhere. In a household where conflict was dangerous and disappearing was the safest available option. In a relationship that taught a man that his presence in an argument made things worse rather than better. In years of experience that encoded the lesson that the way to survive conflict was to not be there for it. Neither pattern is a character flaw. Both patterns were intelligent adaptations to the conditions in which they were formed. The problem is that the conditions changed long ago, and the patterns did not. The man is no longer in the household that required those adaptations. He is no longer in the schoolyard or the early relationship or whatever crucible forged the particular way he moves through conflict. But the lens does not know that. The lens was built in those conditions, and it reads current conditions through that history. And so the man finds himself responding to his partner or his child or his colleague with a set of automatic behaviors that were designed for a completely different situation, in a completely different time, against completely different stakes. He is watching shadows, and the shadow he is watching is not the person in front of him. It is someone from much further back. Plato was interested in a particular kind of man, the man who had been out of the cave, who had seen something truer and more complete than the shadow world, and who then went back. Not because he was forced to, because he chose to. In the allegory, the philosopher who escapes the cave and reaches the sunlight eventually returns to the cave to tell the other prisoners what he has seen. They do not thank him for it. They have organized their entire lives around the shadow world, and the man who tells them the shadows are not the whole story is not experienced as a liberator. He is experienced as a threat. His eyes have adjusted to sunlight, and he can no longer see the shadows as clearly as they can. And so they conclude that he has been damaged by wherever he went, that he sees less now than he did before, that whatever he found out there in the blinding light has made him worse at the only thing that matters, which is reading the shadows on the wall. They want to kill him. Plato wrote the allegory after watching Athens kill Socrates. The connection is not subtle, but the deeper point survives the biographical context. The deeper point is that returning to the cave, choosing to re-enter the world of incomplete perception and inherited assumption and comfortable consensus, is something men do all the time. Not because they are forced, because the alternative is too disorienting, because the sunlight is too much, because the version of reality they have been living inside is familiar, and familiarity has a gravity that is very difficult to escape voluntarily. There is a particular kind of conversation that illustrates this. The conversation a man has with himself after something has gone wrong, a relationship that ended badly, a rift with a son or a daughter that has never fully healed, a friendship that dissolved over something that both men probably remember differently, a professional failure that still carries a charge years later. In that internal conversation, most men do not stay in the sunlight for long. They may begin there. There may be a moment of genuine clarity, a recognition that the full picture is more complicated than the version they have been carrying, that their own choices played a role they have not fully accounted for. But that moment is uncomfortable, and discomfort has a way of generating motion, and the motion is almost always back toward the shadow world, back toward the version of events that is more comfortable, more familiar, more consistent with the man they believe themselves to be. He knows what he has done when he retreats there, not in words, but somewhere underneath the words. That knowing is the thing this chapter is asking you to sit with. There is a second element to Plato's thinking that carries equal weight for the purposes of this courtroom. Plato believed that behind every imperfect, particular real-world thing there existed a perfect form of that thing, a kind of ideal template of which the earthly version was an imperfect copy. Every individual chair in the world was a copy, however approximate, of the form of chair. Every act of justice was a copy, however imperfect, of the form of justice. The real world, in Plato's view, was always a slightly distorted reflection of something more perfect and more real that existed beyond direct perception. You do not have to accept Plato's metaphysics to feel the truth in what he was reaching for. Most men carry an ideal, a picture of how things should be, a version of their life, their marriage, their work, their relationship with their children, that exists somewhere in the mind as a kind of standard against which the actual is always being measured and always, in some ways, found wanting. That ideal was assembled from somewhere, from what was modeled, from what was promised, from what a young man told himself he would have when the future still felt entirely open. The gap between that ideal and the actual is one of the places where a great deal of male suffering lives. Not because the ideal was wrong to have. Ideals are not the problem. The problem is the relationship a man develops with the gap. The man who experiences every distance between the ideal and the real as a personal failure, as evidence that something is wrong with him, or wrong with the people around him, or wrong with the world that did not cooperate with his vision of it, is a man who is always living slightly to the side of the life he actually has. He is always measuring what is against what should be, and the measuring prevents him from being fully present to either. A man carries an ideal of what a marriage should look like. That ideal was built from somewhere, from what he watched, from what he read, from what he was told, from what he imagined when he was standing at the beginning of something and could not yet see its full complexity. And then the marriage reveals itself to be a real thing, with real friction and real seasons and real limitations on both sides, and the gap opens up between what he imagined and what he has. What he does with that gap is one of the most consequential choices of his adult life. Some men respond to the gap with contempt. The real thing is inferior to the ideal, and they treat it accordingly, and the contempt does the slow work of destroying exactly what they were hoping to have. Some men respond with resignation, a flat acceptance that the ideal was a fiction and the real is all there is, and the appropriate response is to stop wanting anything in particular. Some men oscillate between the two, cycling between contempt and resignation, never quite able to accept the real on its own terms or release the ideal with enough honesty to grieve it properly. The examined man, the man Plato is pointing toward, does something different. He looks at the gap directly. He asks where the ideal came from, and whether it was ever fully his own, or whether it was inherited, assumed, absorbed from sources he never chose and never examined. He asks what in the actual is being obscured by his insistence on measuring it against the ideal. He asks whether the life he has, seen clearly and without the distorting overlay of what he imagined it would be, might contain more than he has been able to notice while he was busy being disappointed that it was not something else. That is not a comfortable inquiry, but it is an honest one. There is a practice embedded in Plato's philosophy that does not get discussed enough, which is the practice of returning. Not returning to the cave, returning to the question. Plato believed that genuine understanding was not achieved in a single moment of insight, but through a continuous process of examination, refinement, and return. The dialogues he wrote are not lectures. They are conversations that circle back, that revisit, that arrive at a conclusion and then question the conclusion, that treat understanding not as a destination but as a direction. That is a different relationship with truth than most men have been taught to have. The man who looked at his father 20 years ago and reached a conclusion about him and has been living inside that conclusion ever since may be living inside a shadow, not because the conclusion was wrong, but because the man who reached it was younger, had less information, had less capacity to hold complexity, and was reaching conclusions in the service of emotional survival rather than clarity. The man he is now might see something different if he looked again, might see the fear underneath the anger he spent years resenting, might see the limitation underneath the indifference that felt like rejection, might see a man more like himself than he has been comfortable admitting. Returning to the question is not weakness. It is the thing Plato spent his entire life doing. Before Plato leaves the witness chair, he does what he always does in the dialogues. He turns the question back. He asks, "What would you see if you turned around?" He means the thing behind you, the version of events you have not yet faced, because facing it would require giving up the version you already have. The interpretation of your life that feels like reality, but that you have, if you are honest, occasionally suspected, is something less than the whole story. What would you see if you turned around? You do not have to answer that now. But the fact that the question made you hesitate is itself the beginning of an answer. The witness steps down. The courtroom holds the question in the air for a moment. The third witness is already waiting at the door. Chapter 3. The question of character. What habits are shaping your life? The third witness does not look like a philosopher in the way the word is commonly imagined. He does not have the street-worn plainness of Socrates or the aristocratic deliberateness of Plato, though he studied under Plato for 20 years, and the influence shows in the precision of how he thinks. Aristotle looks like a man who has spent his life paying close attention to things, to how they work, to what they are made of, to the difference between what something appears to be and what it actually is when you examine it carefully enough. He was a biologist as much as a philosopher, a man who dissected animals to understand their structure, who cataloged the natural world with a patience and an eye for detail that his contemporaries found remarkable. He brings that same attention to the question he carries into this courtroom. He sits down, looks at you for a moment, and then asks something that sounds simple until you sit with it. Who are you when nobody is asking? Not who you say you are, not who you intend to be, not the version of yourself you present in the moments when you know you are being observed or evaluated, or when the stakes are high enough to bring out your best. Who are you in the ordinary moments? The unremarkable ones. The moments when no one is watching and nothing is at stake, and the only person who will ever know what you did or said or chose is you. That, Aristotle says, is your character, not the peak moments, the average ones. Aristotle was Plato's student, but he was also, in important ways, Plato's corrective. Where Plato looked upward toward the ideal forms that existed beyond the visible world, Aristotle looked directly at the world in front of him. He was not interested in the perfect form of justice existing in some abstract realm beyond human perception. He was interested in what justice actually looked like when real human beings practiced it in real communities with real competing interests and real limitations. He was not interested in the ideal of a good man as a philosophical abstraction. He was interested in what a good man actually did, day by day, choice by choice, in the specific and often unglamorous conditions of an actual life. This distinction matters because it means Aristotle's ethics are not aspirational in the way that word is usually meant. They are not about holding up an impossible standard and measuring yourself against it. They are about the accumulation of small choices made consistently over time in the direction of what is genuinely good, and the way that accumulation produces, gradually and without drama, a particular kind of person. He called that process the formation of character, and he believed it was the most important project a human life could undertake. The Greek word Aristotle used for the kind of character he was describing is ethos. It is the root of the English word ethics, but that translation does not quite capture what Aristotle meant. When he used the word ethos, he was not primarily talking about a set of rules a person follows. He was talking about something closer to a disposition, a settled way of being, the way a man characteristically moves through the world, responds to difficulty, treats the people around him, handles the gap between what he wants and what is right. Ethos, in Aristotle's usage, is not what you believe. It is what you consistently do. That distinction is one of the most important in this entire courtroom. A man can believe sincerely and without any conscious deception that he is patient or generous or honest or courageous. He can hold that belief about himself with genuine conviction, and he can be wrong. Not because he is lying to himself, but because belief is not the same as character. Belief is what you think about yourself in the moments when you are thinking about yourself. Character is what you actually do in the moments when you are not. Most men have experienced the gap between the two. The man who believes he is patient but who finds himself regularly and predictably losing that patience under specific conditions that he has never quite examined closely enough to understand. The man who believes he is honest but who has developed, over years, a set of small accommodations and selective omissions that serve his interests without quite rising to the level of lies he would recognize as lies. The man who believes he is a good father, but whose children, if asked honestly and without fear of disappointing him, might give a more complicated account. The gap between belief and character is not a moral indictment. It is a structural feature of human psychology. Beliefs are cheap. They are easy to hold and easy to maintain, and they cost nothing until the moment when behavior is required to support them. Character is what behavior reveals when belief is not watching. Aristotle's most direct statement about how character is formed is one of the most quoted lines in all of philosophy, and like most frequently quoted lines, it has been smoothed by repetition into something that sounds pleasant rather than demanding. He said that we are what we repeatedly do. That sentence is usually offered as encouragement, as an invitation to begin a good habit and trust that it will compound over time. And that reading is not wrong, but it leaves out the part that Aristotle was equally insistent upon, which is the inverse. We are also what we repeatedly fail to do. We are what we repeatedly avoid, what we repeatedly defer, what we repeatedly excuse in ourselves with explanations that we would not accept from someone else. We are the sum of our evasions as much as our efforts, and the character that forms from years of consistent avoidance is as real and as stable and as defining as the character that forms from years of consistent practice. A man who has spent 20 years avoiding a difficult conversation with someone he loves has a character that includes that avoidance. It is not an aberration. It is not a phase. It is a habit, and habits are not interruptions to character. They are its raw material. This is not comfortable to hear, but it is precise. Aristotle used the word hexis to describe a habit in the deep sense he meant. Not a routine, not a preference, but a stable disposition of the soul, a groove worn into the character by the repeated passage of the same kind of choice made in the same kind of way across time. He believed that every action a man takes is simultaneously two things. It is the thing itself, the deed, the word, the choice, and it is a small contribution to the formation of the man who took it. Every time you act with courage, you become slightly more courageous. Every time you act with cowardice, you become slightly more cowardly. Every time you tell the truth when it would be easier not to, you reinforce the disposition toward honesty. Every time you lie or shade the truth or construct the more convenient version of events, you reinforce the opposite. The deed and the formation are inseparable. This means that there is no neutral act. There is no action that leaves the character unchanged. The man who believes he is merely responding to circumstances, who frames his choices as reactions rather than initiations, who tells himself that he would be different if things were different, is mistaken in a way that Aristotle would find precisely worth examining, because the character is not formed by the ideal conditions in which a man would prefer to be tested. It is formed by the actual conditions in which he finds himself every day, the ordinary ones, the inconvenient ones, the ones where the easier choice is available and the better choice costs something. Those are the choices that build the man. There is a concept Aristotle called the doctrine of the mean, and it is more subtle and more useful than it first appears. He believed that virtues were not simply opposites of vices. They were the appropriate middle point between two kinds of failure, one of excess and one of deficiency. Courage, for example, was not simply the absence of fear. It was the appropriate relationship to fear. The man who feels no fear at all is not courageous. He is reckless. The man who is paralyzed by fear is not cautious. He is cowardly. Courage is the capacity to feel the fear, assess it honestly, and act appropriately in relation to it. Not in spite of it, in relation to it. The same structure applies to every virtue Aristotle examined. Generosity is the mean between profligacy and miserliness. Honesty is the mean between brutal candor and dishonest accommodation. Confidence is the mean between arrogance and self-deprecation. The virtuous man is not the man who never feels the pull toward either extreme. He is the man who, through long practice, has developed the capacity to find and hold the appropriate position in the middle. That capacity is not innate. It is not given at birth. It is not the product of good intentions. It is earned through repetition. The doctrine of the mean asks not what you are, but how you are, not which category you belong to, but where in the spectrum of human response your habits consistently place you, and whether that position is the one you would choose if you were choosing consciously. Most men have never asked it that way. Aristotle believed in something he called eudaimonia, which is usually translated as happiness, but which carries a meaning the English word does not quite hold. Eudaimonia is not a feeling. It is not the pleasure of a good meal, or the satisfaction of a goal achieved, or the warmth of an evening spent with people you love. Those things are real, and they matter, but they are not what Aristotle meant. Eudaimonia is closer to flourishing, to the condition of a life that is being fully and well lived, in accordance with the best capacities a human being possesses, in the direction of what is genuinely good. It is not something that happens to you. It is something you build through the practice of virtue over the course of a life. A man who organizes his life around the pursuit of feeling good is building something different than a man who organizes his life around the practice of being good. The first man is always at the mercy of circumstances, because circumstances determine how he feels, and circumstances are not fully within his control. The second man has access to something more stable, because the practice of virtue is always available regardless of what the circumstances are doing, and the man who has practiced it long enough has built a character that can sustain him through conditions that would dismantle a man whose foundation was only feeling. That is Aristotle's promise. Not that the virtuous life will be easy or comfortable or free from loss, but that it will be solid. That the man who has spent years building his character through deliberate and consistent practice will have something real to stand on when the ground shifts, as it always does, as it will for every man reading this. The foundation is not luck. It is not circumstance. It is not the quality of what life has given you. It is what you have done, repeatedly, in the direction of what is good. Now bring this into the specific gravity of your own life, not in the abstract, in the particular. Think about the man you are in the morning before anyone else is awake. In the car when someone cuts you off and no one who knows you is watching. In the conversation where you have the power and the other person does not, and the outcome will be entirely shaped by whether you use that power well or badly. In the moment when telling the whole truth would cost you something, and a partial truth would cost you nothing. Think about the man you are when you are tired, when you are disappointed, when something you worked for did not come through, when someone you love says something that lands like a judgment, even if it was not meant that way. Think about the man you are when you are alone. That man, the one in those moments, is not a different version of you. He is not a worse version or a truer version, or a version that somehow does not count. He is you. He is the product of everything you have practiced, everything you have reinforced, every choice you have made when no one was watching and the only stakes were the ones inside your own chest. Aristotle would ask you to look at him honestly, not with contempt. Character is not a courtroom where you prosecute yourself into paralysis. That is not what this examination is for. Aristotle was deeply practical in his ethics, and the practical purpose of seeing your habits clearly is not to condemn them, but to understand them well enough to change the ones that are not serving what you actually value. The question is not whether you have habits that work against you. Every man does. The question is whether you know which ones they are, because you cannot change what you cannot see. There is one more thing Aristotle insists upon that tends to make people uncomfortable when it is stated plainly, which is that character is not a private matter. He believed that human beings were by nature political animals, which in his vocabulary meant that we were creatures who reached our full human potential only in community, in relationship, in the specific friction and warmth and obligation of living alongside other people and being shaped by that proximity. A man cannot develop virtue in isolation. The virtues Aristotle cared about, courage, generosity, honesty, justice, are all relational. They require other people to practice against. They are called into being by the presence of others and tested by the specific difficulties that other people introduce into a life. This means that the man you are in relationship is not a subset of your character. It is the primary evidence of it. What you are to your partner in the ordinary moments of an ordinary week is your character. What you are to your children in the unremarkable exchanges that make up the vast majority of the time you spend with them is your character. What you are to the people who work with you or for you in the interactions that are too small to feel significant but that are happening constantly is your character. The grand gesture is almost irrelevant. Any man can rise to a dramatic moment. The dramatic moments are few and they carry their own instruction. What Aristotle is asking about is the texture, the pattern, the accumulated weight of ordinary behavior across years of ordinary time. That is the testimony your life is giving, whether you are aware of giving it or not. Before Aristotle leaves the witness chair, he does something neither Socrates nor Plato did. He does not ask a question. He makes a statement. He says, "You already know what needs to change." He does not say this with cruelty. He says it with the matter-of-fact precision of a man who has spent his life studying how human beings actually work, rather than how they wish they worked. He has watched enough men, thought carefully enough about the structure of human character, to know that the gap between what a man knows and what a man does is not usually a problem of information. It is a problem of practice. Most men already know, somewhere in the part of themselves they do not always visit in daylight, which habits are building them towards something good and which habits are quietly building something else. The question is not whether you know. The question is what you're going to do about it, starting tomorrow morning, in the ordinary moments when no one is watching and the only person keeping score is you. The witness steps down. The courtroom is quiet for a moment longer than usual. The fourth witness will be harder. The third witness said you already know what needs to change. But knowing what needs to change and knowing where it came from are different projects. Before a man decides whether to keep a habit, it is worth understanding who gave it to him. The fourth witness is going to reach back before the conscious man and ask about the man who was given to you before you had any say in the matter. Before he enters, sit with a specific set of questions. What did the men in your early life believe about emotion? What did they believe about asking for help? What did they believe a man was supposed to be able to handle alone? What did they believe about apologizing? What did they believe about the kind of man who talked about what he was feeling? Sit with those questions not as accusations, but as inventory. The most dangerous beliefs are not the ones a man holds consciously, but the ones he has absorbed so thoroughly that he no longer experiences them as beliefs at all, as simply the way things are. Which of your beliefs about manhood have you actually examined? Which have you simply lived inside? Which would survive honest scrutiny? Which would not? The fourth witness is about to be called. He is going to ask who built you. Chapter 4. The question of identity. Who taught you to be who you are? The fourth witness arrives with more weight than the others. Not physical weight, something else. The kind of presence that enters a room before the person does, that changes the atmosphere slightly, that makes you sit up without quite knowing why. Friedrich Nietzsche does not look like a man who is easy to be around. He has the mustache that history has made famous and eyes that seem to be doing more work than eyes usually do, taking in more, filing it differently, arriving at conclusions that most people would prefer not to follow him toward. He was not a comfortable thinker. He was not trying to be. He believed that comfort, particularly intellectual comfort, was one of the primary enemies of genuine human development, and he spent his entire career doing everything he could to make it unavailable to anyone paying attention to him. He sits down and looks at you for a long moment before he speaks. Then he says, "Before we talk about who you are, I want to know who built you, not who raised you, not who influenced you in the ways you would willingly acknowledge in polite conversation. Who built you? Who put the architecture in place before you were old enough to know that architecture was being installed? who handed you the values you carry as though they were your own, the definitions of strength and weakness you have never questioned, the picture of what a man is supposed to be that you have been measuring yourself against your entire life without ever stopping to ask where that picture came from or whether it belongs to you at all. Who built you? And does the man they built still serve the man you are trying to become? Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Prussia, the son of a Lutheran pastor who died when Friedrich was 4 years old. He was a prodigy-appointed professor at the University of Basel at 24, before he had completed his doctorate. He is also one of the most misread thinkers in the history of ideas. His work was appropriated after his death by his sister Elizabeth, who edited and manipulated his unpublished notebooks to make them appear to support views he had explicitly and repeatedly rejected. The damage that distortion did to his reputation lasted for decades. It is worth saying clearly, Nietzsche was not a proto-fascist. He was a man who looked with unflinching honesty at the structures of value his culture had inherited and asked whether those structures were genuinely serving human flourishing or whether they had become a way of managing, constraining, and diminishing it. That question is the one he brings into this courtroom. The concept Nietzsche is most associated with is the will to power, and it is almost universally misunderstood. It does not mean the desire to dominate other people. It describes something more fundamental and more interior, the drive in every living thing toward the expression of its own particular nature, toward becoming more fully what it actually is, rather than what it has been told to be. The opposite of the will to power was what he called ressentiment, a condition in which blocked energy turns inward and transforms into a system of values that celebrates limitation, that reframes weakness as virtue, that finds ways to make the inability to act feel like a moral choice. He was describing the man who has been taught that certain feelings are not acceptable, that certain needs are not legitimate, and who has responded not by examining that teaching, but by building his identity around its requirements, who has learned to call his constraints his values, who has learned to experience his limitations as his character. That man does not know he has done this. That is precisely what makes it worth examining. Nietzsche introduced a distinction between what he called master morality and slave morality, and it is worth understanding carefully before you decide what to do with it. Master morality originates in self-affirmation. It begins with a person saying, "Here is what I value, here is what I call good, here is the kind of life I'm choosing to live." The values come from the inside out, generated by someone acting from their own genuine nature, rather than reacting to the nature of others. Slave morality originates differently. It begins not with self-affirmation, but with negation, with resentment of those who have what the slave morality person lacks, and it builds a value system around inverting the terms of that resentment. What the powerful have becomes bad. What the powerless have becomes good. The problem Nietzsche was identifying was not with the values themselves, but with their origin. A value that exists because you have genuinely examined it and chosen it is a very different thing from a value that exists because someone taught you to call your limitations virtues. The question this forces is one that most men find genuinely uncomfortable. How many of the values you carry most confidently were chosen by you? And how many were installed before you had any capacity to choose? Every man inherits a template of masculinity. It arrives before language, before conscious thought, before any ability to evaluate what is being transmitted. It arrives through the specific behavior of the specific men in the immediate world of a specific boy, the father most centrally, but also the uncles, the older brothers, the coaches, the teachers, the men on screens, the cultural messaging that surrounds a child so completely and so constantly that it becomes invisible, the way water is invisible to a fish. That template contains instructions. Most of them are never spoken aloud. They do not need to be. They are transmitted through observation, through the specific things that are rewarded and the specific things that produce shame or silence, or the withdrawal of approval, through what the men around a boy do with pain, and what they do with tenderness, and what they do with fear, and what they do when they are wrong, through what gets called strength and what gets called weakness, and where exactly the line between them is drawn, and what happens to a boy who ends up on the wrong side of it. By the time a man is an adult, that template is not experienced as a set of instructions he received. It is experienced as his own nature. This is the central difficulty. When something has been present long enough, when it arrived early enough and was reinforced consistently enough, it stops feeling like something that was put there and starts feeling like something that was always there, like character, like personality, like simply who you are. Nietzsche would say that is precisely when the examination needs to begin. There is a concept in Nietzsche's work he called the herd, and it is one of the places where he is most easily misread. The herd does not mean other people in a contemptuous sense. He was describing a particular kind of conformity, so complete and so unconscious that the person inside it has stopped being able to distinguish between what they actually believe and what the herd has taught them to believe. The herd mind takes the values of the collective and presents them as natural, as obvious, as the way things simply are. And the individual inside the herd absorbs those values so thoroughly that any genuine questioning of whether they are right produces not just social pressure, but internal anxiety. The man who questions the herd's values does not just risk disapproval, he risks the dissolution of the identity he has built inside those values. That is a very high price. Most men will not pay it voluntarily. But Nietzsche believed that the man who could not or would not question the values he had inherited was not truly free, regardless of how free he felt. He was carrying out instructions he had been given, living inside a template he had not chosen, performing a version of manhood that had been handed to him complete and unexamined, and calling it his own life. Consider the specific template of masculinity you were handed. What did it say about emotion? Most templates of traditional masculinity have very specific and very narrow instructions about which emotions are acceptable for a man to feel and express, and which are not. Anger tends to be permitted because anger can be useful in the service of protection and competition. Fear tends to be suppressed because fear signals vulnerability, and vulnerability signals weakness. Grief tends to be minimized because grief requires a man to be visibly undone by something. And being visibly undone is not consistent with the image of control that many masculinity templates demand. Tenderness, longing, uncertainty, the full complicated range of what it is to be a human being moving through a human life. These tend to be classified in many masculinity templates as things that are acceptable in private, if at all, but that must not surface in the world where other men can see them. What that produces over decades of practice is a man who has learned to route his emotional life through a very narrow channel, who has become genuinely skilled at suppressing what the template does not permit, who may have done it so thoroughly and for so long that he has lost access to the suppressed material entirely, or who experiences its surfacing as a kind of failure, as evidence that something in him is not quite right. That is not character. That is conditioning. And Nietzsche would want you to know the difference. He would also want you to ask what it has cost you, not in the abstract, in the specific, in your relationships, in the gap between the man you are in public and whatever is happening in the private interior that public performance is managing, in the moments when something broke through the template and you felt, perhaps briefly and uncomfortably, something that the template did not have a name for, something that did not fit the instructions, something that was yours rather than the herd's. What did you do with that? Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, usually translated as the overman or the superman, has been so thoroughly misappropriated that it is worth reclaiming for what he actually meant. The overman is not a superior human being in any genetic or hierarchical sense. He is a man who has overcome himself, who has looked honestly at the values and templates and instructions he inherited, separated what is genuinely his own from what was installed without his consent, discarded what does not serve the man he actually is, and chosen, with full awareness of what he is choosing, the values he will live by going forward. That is a project that never finishes. It requires continuous return, continuous examination, Continuous willingness to discover that what felt like genuine choice was actually inherited assumption wearing the clothes of conviction. But it is the project Nietzsche believed was the most essentially human one available. He said that the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Read that again slowly. No price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself, not owning other people, not dominating the landscape of your life, owning yourself, having access to who you actually are rather than who you were built to perform, being able to look at your own values and know with something approaching honesty that they are yours, that you chose them, that they emerged from genuine examination rather than from the accumulated pressure of everything you absorbed before you were old enough to examine anything. That kind of ownership is rarer than it sounds. Most men, if they are honest, carry large portions of themselves that do not quite feel like their own, the parts that were handed to them complete, with instructions already attached, the parts they have never quite been able to look at directly, because looking at them directly would require renegotiating too much of what they have built on top of them. Nietzsche is not asking you to tear down the structure. He is asking you to know which parts of it you chose and which parts you inherited, and to do the slow, uncomfortable work of deciding, with full awareness and full honesty, which ones you want to keep. Before Nietzsche leaves the witness chair, he does something that surprises you. He does not make a declaration. He does not deliver a verdict. He leans forward slightly and asks a question that is quieter than anything he has said so far. Is the man you have become the man you would have chosen to become if you had been given the choice? He does not wait for an answer. He does not need to. The question is not asking for a response in this moment. It is asking for a life's worth of honest attention in the moments that follow. He stands. He walks out of the courtroom without looking back. The room is quieter than it was before he entered. The fifth witness will ask about something the fourth witness made possible: what to do with the feelings that the template told you to put somewhere else. Chapter 5. The question of emotion. What role should feelings play in a life? The fifth witness takes the chair differently than the others, not with the street-worn directness of Socrates, or the aristocratic deliberateness of Plato, or the clinical precision of Aristotle, or the charged intensity of Nietzsche. David Hume settles into the witness chair the way a man settles into a conversation he has been looking forward to. There is something almost comfortable about him, something warm and socially at ease that his philosophy does not prepare you for. He was known in Edinburgh and Paris as one of the most agreeable men of his era, a dinner companion people sought out, a man who laughed easily and argued without cruelty and seemed genuinely interested in the people around him. He was also the man who looked more honestly at the role of emotion in human life than almost any philosopher before or since, and what he found there was not comfortable at all. He sits down, looks at you with something that resembles genuine curiosity, and asks a question that the previous four witnesses did not quite get around to. What are you actually feeling right now? Not what you think about what you are feeling, not the story you have constructed around it, or the judgment you have applied to it, or the amount of time you have spent deciding whether it is an appropriate thing to feel. What is actually present in you, right now, underneath the thinking? Most men need a moment with that question. Some men need considerably longer. David Hume was born in Edinburgh in 1711 and spent his life following the evidence of careful observation wherever it led, regardless of whether it confirmed what people already believed. What he observed, with the patience and precision of a man who trusted his own attention, was this: reason alone does not move human beings to act. It never has. It never will. Reason is a remarkable instrument. It can identify relationships between ideas, trace consequences, evaluate evidence, construct arguments of considerable sophistication and power, but it cannot, by itself, produce the motivation to do anything at all. The engine of human behavior is not thought, it is feeling. This was a radical claim in an era organized around the conviction that human beings were most fully themselves when they were thinking clearly, that progress was a function of reason applied systematically to the problems of human life, that the emotions were a kind of noise in the signal, a complication to be managed and ideally overcome by the clear light of rational thought. Hume looked at all of that and said, respectfully but without equivocation, that it was backwards. Reason, he argued, is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. That sentence shocked people when he wrote it. It still has the capacity to unsettle, which is one of the signs that it is worth taking seriously. He meant that when you trace any human motivation back far enough, you always arrive at a feeling. Always. The man who works hard because he values achievement because it produces a feeling, whether that feeling is pride or security or the satisfaction of being seen or the relief of not being the thing his father predicted he would be. The man who tells the truth because he values honesty because dishonesty produces a feeling he cannot live with. The man who sacrifices for his children does so because he loves them, and love is not a conclusion, it is a feeling. Reason enters after the feeling. It maps the territory. It finds the most efficient route to what the feeling wants. It evaluates options and identifies consequences and sometimes usefully slows the feeling down long enough to ask whether what it wants is actually what it needs. But reason does not generate the wanting. It never does. The man who does not understand this about himself is at the mercy of feelings he cannot see. Because unfelt feelings do not disappear. They operate. They shape perception, motivation, and behavior from underneath the level of conscious thought, in the same way that a current operates beneath the surface of water that appears still. The man who believes he is making a purely rational decision is very often making an emotional one that has been dressed in rational clothing, and the dressing is convincing enough that he cannot tell the difference. Hume would say that is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of self-knowledge. There is a particular relationship between men and their emotional lives that is worth examining directly here, without softening it or approaching it from an angle. Most men in most cultures have been taught, in the ways the previous chapter examined, that a significant portion of their emotional life is not acceptable. Not the anger, usually. Anger tends to be permitted, even valorized, in masculine templates, because anger looks like force, and force looks like strength. And strength is what the template rewards. But the softer emotions, the ones that require a man to be visibly affected by something, visibly moved, visibly open in a way that cannot be quickly resolved into action or aggression, those tend to be classified in most masculinity templates as things that belong somewhere else, in private, in silence, nowhere, ideally. What this produces over the course of a life is a man who has developed a genuine expertise in not feeling what he is feeling. This is not a small thing. It takes real skill, the ability to route an emotion away from conscious awareness before it surfaces, to convert it into something more acceptable, to feel anger instead of grief, to feel contempt instead of fear, to feel nothing instead of the thing that is actually present. This is a capacity that is developed through years of practice and reinforced by everything the template rewards. The problem is that it does not work the way the man performing it believes it works. The emotion that is not felt does not go away. It goes somewhere else. It shows up in the body, in tension and illness, and the particular exhaustion of a man who is spending enormous energy managing what he will not acknowledge. It shows up in behavior, in patterns he cannot fully explain, in responses that are disproportionate to their apparent causes, in the sudden eruption of feeling in contexts where it does not belong because it has been accumulating pressure from the contexts where it was suppressed. It shows up in the quality of his relationships, in the specific distance he maintains between himself and the people he loves, in the ways he is present and the ways he is not, in what he can receive and what he deflects before it can land. Hume would say that the man who does not know what he is feeling does not know what is driving him. And a man who does not know what is driving him is not in control of his life, regardless of how much control he appears to have from the outside. There's a distinction Hume drew between what he called calm passions and violent passions that is more useful than the terminology initially suggests. He was not using violent to mean destructive or calm to mean weak. He was describing the intensity with which a feeling presents itself to consciousness. Violent passions are the ones that announce themselves loudly, that arrive with physical force and demand immediate attention. Anger, fear, lust, grief in its acute phase. These are not difficult to identify. They make themselves known. Calm passions are more subtle. They are the feelings that operate at a lower register, that are easy to overlook or misidentify precisely because they do not arrive with noise. The quiet longing for something you have never quite named. The steady undercurrent of dissatisfaction in a life that looks, from the outside, like it has everything it needs. The dull persistence of a feeling you have been carrying for so long that it has started to feel like personality rather than emotion. The love that has become so habitual that you have stopped noticing it until something threatens to take it away. Hume was interested in the calm passions because he believed they were, in many ways, more powerful than the violent ones, not more intense in their presentation, but more directive, more shaping of a life over time. A violent passion flares and subsides. A calm passion is always present, always operating, always nudging a man toward or away from things without the dramatic announcement that would make it easy to identify and examine. Most men know their violent passions reasonably well. They have had to contend with them directly, have had to develop some relationship with anger or fear, or the acute forms of desire, if only to manage their expression in contexts where expression would be costly. The calm passions tend to go unexamined, and it is in the calm passions that some of the most important information about a man's actual life is stored. Here is a question worth sitting with, in the way Hume would want you to sit with it. Not quickly, not with the goal of arriving at an answer that is clean and manageable, with genuine curiosity and genuine patience, the way you would sit with a puzzle that you knew was worth solving, even though the solving would take longer than you wanted it to. What is the feeling you have been carrying the longest? Not the most dramatic feeling. Not the one that announces itself most loudly. The one that has been present for so long that you have mostly stopped noticing it. The one that is part of the weather of your interior life rather than a specific storm. The one that colors how you see things without your being quite aware that a coloring is happening. For some men, it is a grief that was never fully processed, that got compressed into something more manageable at a moment when there was no space to feel it fully, and that has been compressed ever since. For some men, it is a longing for connection or recognition or the kind of closeness that the template they were handed made it difficult to ask for directly. For some men, it is a fear, low and persistent, that something they have built is not as solid as it looks, that the version of themselves they have been presenting to the world is more performance than substance, that at some point someone will notice the gap. For some men, it is something harder to name than any of those, something that does not have a clean label, that resists the categories, that is simply a presence underneath everything else. Hume would not ask you to do anything dramatic with whatever you find there. He would ask you simply to acknowledge it, to let it be what it is instead of what you have been telling yourself it is not. To allow the information it carries to be available to you rather than spending the energy required to keep it somewhere it cannot be heard. Because that energy is not free. It costs something every day. And what it costs tends to come out of exactly the things you most want to protect. There is a concept in Hume's philosophy called sympathy, and it is worth examining here because it connects the interior work this chapter is asking about to the relational life that Aristotle identified as the primary evidence of a man's character. Hume used sympathy to describe the capacity to feel what another person is feeling, to have genuine access to the interior experience of someone other than yourself, not as an intellectual exercise, but as an actual emotional event. He believed this capacity was foundational to human moral life, that without it, ethics was merely a set of rules a person followed for instrumental reasons, rather than because they had genuine access to why the rules mattered. The capacity for sympathy requires that a man be on speaking terms with his own emotional life. A man who has spent decades suppressing, rerouting, and avoiding his own interior experience does not thereby become capable of accessing someone else's. The work of knowing what you feel is not separate from the work of being genuinely close to another person. It is the prerequisite for it. Hume died in 1776 at the age of 65, and the account of his death is one of the most remarkable things about him. He was calm. He was in good spirits. He showed none of the terror or desperation that people around him expected from a man who did not believe in an afterlife and who knew he was dying. His friend Adam Smith, who visited him in his final weeks, wrote that Hume faced death with more genuine equanimity than he had ever witnessed in a person, and that the equanimity appeared to come not from indifference, but from a kind of settled satisfaction with the life he had lived. He had felt what he felt. He had examined it honestly. He had let the feelings inform his thinking and his relationships and his work, and he had not spent his life in the service of suppressing them into something more acceptable. And at the end, there was nothing unfinished in the way that there is something unfinished in a man who has spent his life managing his interior life rather than inhabiting it. Before Hume leaves the witness chair, he does something that fits him perfectly. He does not deliver a conclusion. He does not make a pronouncement, or issue a challenge, or leave you with a declaration designed to stay with you like a splinter. He simply asks, with the genuine curiosity that characterized everything about him, whether you are willing to be more honest with yourself about what you are carrying than you have been until now. Not more expressive, not more demonstrative. Not required to perform emotion in ways that feel false or forced or inconsistent with who you are. Just more honest, with yourself, about what is actually there. He stands, gives you a nod that contains something like encouragement, and walks out of the courtroom. The room feels slightly different after he leaves. A little more interior, a little more honest about what has been present all along, but not quite named. The sixth witness is already at the door. He is going to ask about what you do with what you know. If a man does not know what drives him, the court wonders how well he actually knows the man in the private moments. That is the territory the sixth witness is about to enter. Before he does, one more thing worth considering. How do you define success? Not the answer you would give in a professional context, the private definition, the one that runs underneath the public one. The one by which you actually measure yourself in the quiet moments, when no one is around and the day has ended, and you are left with the question of whether it was enough. Where did that definition come from? Was it given to you by someone whose approval you were trying to earn? Was it assembled from the evidence of what your particular culture rewards? Was it shaped by a fear rather than a value? By the terror of a particular kind of failure rather than the genuine desire for a particular kind of life? Most men are living inside a definition of success they never consciously chose. The definition arrived early, was reinforced consistently, and has been operating ever since as an invisible standard against which everything is measured and much is found wanting. If you achieved everything your definition of success requires, would you feel that your life had been well lived? If that question gives you any hesitation at all, sit with the hesitation before the sixth witness enters. The sixth witness enters. Chapter 6. The question of integrity. Who are you when nobody is watching? The sixth witness enters the courtroom with a punctuality that feels almost architectural. Immanuel Kant was, by all historical accounts, a man of extraordinary routine. He lived his entire life within a few miles of Königsberg, the Prussian city where he was born, and he organized his days with a precision that his neighbors reportedly used to set their clocks. He rose at the same hour, walked the same route, worked at the same times, and went to bed at the same hour, day after day, decade after decade. He never married. He traveled almost nowhere. He lived what looked from the outside like an extraordinarily narrow life. And he produced from within that narrow life a philosophical system of such depth and rigor that it changed the direction of Western thought and has not been fully answered in the 2.5 centuries since he wrote it. He sits down in the witness chair with the composure of a man who has given his question a great deal of thought and is not in any hurry to rush past it. The question he carries into this courtroom is deceptively simple. Who are you when nobody is watching? Not who you intend to be. Not who you are in the moments when the presence of other people calls out the version of yourself you most want to present. Not who you are when the stakes are visible and the audience is real, and the consequences of behaving badly are concrete and immediate. Who are you in the private moments, the ones that leave no trace, the ones where the only record is the one you carry inside yourself, and where the only person who will ever know what you did or chose or said is you? That, Kant would tell you, is where your actual moral life lives. Kant was born in 1724 in Königsberg to a family of modest means and deep religious faith that gave him a permanent and serious attention to the interior, to the question of what a person actually is underneath the performance, to the difference between the man who behaves well because he has calculated that behaving well serves his interests, and the man who behaves well because he genuinely believes it is the right thing to do, to the gap, which can be enormous, between what a person appears to be and what they actually are in the private recesses of their own motivation. That gap is what Kant's ethics are built to address. He was not interested in behavior as evidence of character in the simple sense. He was interested in the motivation underneath the behavior because he believed that was where the actual moral substance of a person resided. A man who tells the truth because he is afraid of being caught lying is not, in any meaningful sense, an honest man. He is a man managing risk. A man who is generous because generosity enhances his reputation is not, in any meaningful sense, a generous man. He is a man investing in a particular kind of social capital. The behavior may look identical from the outside. The moral reality is entirely different. Kant wanted to know what was driving the behavior when nothing external was driving it, when there was no audience, when there was no consequence, when the only thing left in the room was the man himself and the question of what he actually believed and what he was actually willing to do about it. The concept at the center of Kant's ethics is what he called the categorical imperative, and it is one of the most discussed and most debated ideas in the history of moral philosophy. He formulated it in several ways, each illuminating a different face of the same underlying idea. The most famous formulation is this: act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In plainer language, before you do something, ask whether you would be comfortable if everyone did it. Not whether you can get away with it. Not whether it serves your interests in this particular situation. Whether the principle behind your action is one you would endorse as a general rule for all human behavior. If the answer is no, you already know something important about what you are about to do. The man who cuts corners on something when no one is checking would not endorse a world in which everyone cut corners when no one was checking. The man who withholds an important piece of information because sharing it would be inconvenient would not endorse a world in which everyone withheld important information when sharing it was inconvenient. The man who holds other people to standards he does not apply to himself would not endorse a world in which everyone held other people to standards they did not apply to themselves. The test does not require elaborate philosophical reasoning. It requires honesty. And honesty, in the private application of this test, is exactly what most men find most difficult. Kant made a distinction that is central to this chapter, and that does not get discussed as plainly as it deserves to be. He distinguished between acting in accordance with duty and acting from duty. Acting in accordance with duty means doing the right thing. Acting from duty means doing the right thing because it is the right thing, not because of what it produces, not because of how it reflects on you, not because of the social rewards that accompany being seen as a person of integrity, because it is, in your own private and honest assessment, the right thing to do. Kant believed that only the second of these had genuine moral worth. This is a hard position. It asks not just that you behave well, but that you examine why you are behaving well. and that you be honest about the answer, even when the honest answer is less flattering than the one you would prefer. Because most men, if they sit quietly with this question, will discover that a significant portion of what they think of as their integrity is actually reputation management. That the behaviors they are most proud of tend to be the ones that are most visible. That the private choices, the ones made in the absence of any audience, are sometimes at a different standard than the public ones. Not dramatically different, perhaps, but different enough that the difference is worth examining. That examination is not comfortable. But Kant would say it is exactly the one that matters. There is a second formulation of the categorical imperative that Kant considered equally fundamental, and that speaks more directly to the question of how a man treats the people in his life. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. This formulation is worth sitting with for longer than it takes to read it. To treat a person as an end means to recognize their full humanity, their interior life, their needs, their dignity, their capacity to suffer and to flourish. Their status as someone who exists for their own purposes and not merely in relation to yours. It means that in your dealings with them, their well-being and their dignity are part of the consideration, not an afterthought, not a constraint on what you want to do, but a genuine and weighty part of the moral calculation. To treat a person merely as a means is to reduce them to their usefulness to you, to relate to them primarily in terms of what they provide, what they serve, what function they fill in the structure of your life, without genuine attention to what is happening inside them or what your treatment of them is doing to them. Most men do not treat people merely as means in any dramatic or deliberate sense. The reduction tends to be subtler than that. It tends to live in patterns of inattention. In the habit of being present to people when their presence serves you and less present when it does not. In the tendency to listen most carefully when the conversation is about something you want to understand, and less carefully when it is about something the other person needs to express. In the way a man can be enormously generous to the people he is trying to impress, and significantly less generous to the people he takes for granted. The people you take for granted are the primary evidence of whether you are treating people as ends or merely as means, not the people you are trying to win over, the ones who are already there, the ones whose continued presence you have stopped working for because their continued presence feels guaranteed. Kant is asking you to think about those people. Kant would not call it hypocrisy. He would call it the failure to universalize. The condition of a man who operates by one set of standards when he is the subject and a different set of standards when he is the judge, who holds other people accountable for behavior he exempts in himself, who finds compelling reasons why the rules that apply generally do not apply in his particular case, given the specific circumstances, given what he has been through, given what the other person did first. Every man does this to some degree. It is one of the most reliable features of human moral psychology. The question Kant is asking is not whether you have ever done it. You have. The question is whether you know when you are doing it, whether you have developed the capacity to catch yourself in the act of applying different standards to yourself than you would apply to someone else in the same situation, and to ask, honestly, what that asymmetry reveals about the gap between the values you profess and the values you actually live by. That gap, in Kant's view, is not a minor personal failing. It is the central moral question of a man's life. Because the man who has closed the gap, who lives by the same standards in private that he professes in public, who treats the people who cannot benefit him with the same consideration he extends to the people who can, who does the right thing when no one is watching with the same consistency that he does it when everyone is, that man has something that cannot be taken away from him by circumstance or reputation or the opinion of other people. He has integrity in the exact sense of the word, not the performance of integrity, the thing itself. Consider what it would mean to apply Kant's standard honestly to the interior of your own life, not to the visible behaviors. Not to the things you do in public or in the presence of people whose opinion matters to you, to the private ones, the choices you make when no one is watching, the standards you apply to yourself in the silence of your own conscience, the gap, if there is one, between who you are in the world and who you are when the world cannot see you. Most men have a private standard and a public one, and the distance between them varies. For some men, it is small. For others, it is large enough that navigating the distance has become one of the central organizational features of their life. The management of what is visible and what is not, the careful calibration of what they present and what they conceal. That management is exhausting, not because it requires tremendous effort in any single moment, but because it is continuous. It never stops. The man who is performing a version of himself that is not fully consistent with who he actually is in private must always be monitoring the performance, always be aware of who is watching and what they can see, and whether anything is showing that should not be showing. That vigilance is not neutral. It draws on something. And what it draws on tends to come from the same reserves that genuine presence, genuine intimacy, and genuine rest require. Kant is not asking you to confess your private self to the world. He is asking whether you can bring your private self into closer alignment with the man you present to it. Whether the work of closing the gap between who you are when you are watched and who you are when you are not is work you are willing to do because it is the right thing to do, not because anyone will ever know whether you did it. That is precisely the condition under which it matters most. Integrity is not summoned in crisis. It is built in the ordinary time that precedes it. The man who is honest when it costs him something has usually been building the habit of honesty in the many small moments when it cost him nothing. The man who is generous under pressure has usually been practicing generosity in the moments when no one was watching and nothing was at stake. The man who treats people with dignity when dignity is inconvenient has usually developed the habit of treating people with dignity when it was easy, long enough that the habit is more powerful than the inconvenience. Before Kant leaves the witness chair, he asks the question he came here to ask in the form that he considers most honest. He says, if the only record of your life were the private one, the one that contains everything you have done when no one was watching and nothing external was at stake, would you recognize the man in that record as the man you believe yourself to be? He does not ask it with cruelty. He asks it with the precise and serious attention of a man who has spent his entire life trying to close the gap between what he believed and how he lived, and who understands that the question is not a judgment, but an invitation to stop managing the gap and start closing it, one private choice at a time, in the moments when no one will ever know. He stands, straightens his coat with the same precision he brings to everything, and walks out of the courtroom. The room is very quiet. The seventh witness is going to ask about something that requires everything the previous six have built toward. He's going to ask what you do when the ground disappears. Before he enters, the court asks you to consider the questions you have never asked yourself, not the questions you have been afraid to ask other people, the questions you have been afraid to ask yourself. Is this the life you would have chosen? Not is this a good life, not is this a life you should be grateful for. Is this the specific life you would have chosen with the full awareness of what choosing actually means, if the choosing had been genuinely yours? Is there something you have been waiting to do that you have run out of good reasons to keep waiting on? Is there a conversation you have been avoiding so long that the avoidance has become its own kind of answer? Is there a version of yourself you have been keeping in reserve, telling yourself you will become that man when the conditions are right, when the time is better, when you are more ready, knowing somewhere underneath that the conditions will never be exactly right, and the readiness you are waiting for may not come from waiting? Most men carry at least one unasked question. Its weight becomes so familiar that the man has stopped noticing he is carrying it. The seventh witness will have something to say about what it costs to keep carrying it. He enters now. The question of courage. What do you do when certainty disappears? The seventh witness enters the courtroom as though he is not entirely sure he should be here. That is not weakness. It is something else. Soren Kierkegaard moves with the slightly hesitant quality of a man who has thought too carefully about too many things to be comfortable with the performance of confidence. He was, by most historical accounts, a difficult person to be around in the ordinary social sense. Anxious, intense, prone to indirect communication, deeply private about the things that mattered most to him, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of smooth social presentation that makes a person easy to categorize. He was also one of the most courageous thinkers who ever lived. Not courageous in the way that word is usually applied to philosophers, meaning willing to argue an unpopular position in an academic journal. Courageous in the way it applies to a man who looked directly at the most terrifying features of human existence, the radical uncertainty of it, the impossibility of guarantees, the requirement to act and choose and commit in the complete absence of certainty about whether what you are doing is right, and who refused to look away or reach for a comfortable answer that would make the terror manageable. He sits down in the witness chair with the careful attention of a man who has been waiting for this particular conversation for a long time. He says, "I want to talk to you about what you do when you cannot be sure." Soren Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in 1813, the youngest of 7 children, raised in the shadow of a father whose religious conviction was inseparable from a significant psychological darkness. He was brilliant and melancholic, possessed of a wit that could be devastating, and a capacity for tenderness that he rarely allowed to be seen. He studied theology, fell in love with a young woman named Regine Olsen, became engaged to her, and then broke the engagement in a decision that tormented him for the rest of his life, and that generated some of the most searching philosophical writing about love, commitment, and the nature of choice that exists in any language. He died at 42. In the decade before his death, he produced a body of work that founded the philosophical tradition known as existentialism, though he would not have recognized the term, and that addressed with more honesty and more precision than almost any other thinker the specific anxiety that attaches to being a human being who must choose and act in a world that offers no guarantees. The concept at the center of Kierkegaard's thought, the one that this chapter is built around, is what he called the leap. Not the leap of faith in the watered-down sentimental sense that phrase has accumulated from overuse. The leap in the specific and demanding sense Kierkegaard meant, which is the act of committing to something, of choosing and acting and giving yourself fully to a course of action or a relationship or a value, in the complete absence of certainty that you are right to do so. The leap is what a man does when he can no longer reason his way to safety. Kierkegaard observed, with the precision of a man who had lived this problem rather than merely theorized about it, that the most important choices in a human life are precisely the ones that cannot be made on the basis of sufficient evidence. The evidence is never sufficient. The calculation never closes. The argument for commitment never achieves the kind of logical completeness that would make commitment feel like the obvious conclusion rather than the terrifying risk that it is. A man who waits for certainty before he commits to anything important will wait forever. And the waiting, Kierkegaard understood, is its own kind of choice, not the absence of a choice. A choice for paralysis, a choice for the life that remains perpetually unlived because the risk of living it was never acceptable. That choice has consequences as real and as lasting as any other. Kierkegaard described human existence in terms of stages or spheres, each representing a different relationship to the fundamental questions of how to live. The first he called the aesthetic stage. The man in the aesthetic stage organizes his life around the pursuit of interesting experience, around pleasure and novelty and the avoidance of boredom. He moves through the world sampling, trying things, keeping his options open, refusing to commit to anything that would close off other possibilities. He is often charming and often miserable because the aesthetic life generates a particular kind of despair that comes from the discovery that no amount of experience, however rich or varied, fills the specific emptiness that comes from a life without genuine commitment. The second stage he called the ethical. The man in the ethical stage has recognized the inadequacy of the aesthetic and has responded by committing himself to a set of principles, to the demands of duty and responsibility and the claims of other people. He takes his obligations seriously. He tries to live up to what he believes is right. This is a genuine advance over the aesthetic in Kierkegaard's view, but it carries its own limitation, which is the discovery that ethical living by its own resources is not sufficient, that the demands of genuine ethics exceed what any man can meet through effort and will alone, and that the gap between what is required and what any human being can produce generates its own form of despair. The third stage he called the religious, not religious in the institutional sense, not the performance of doctrine or the membership in a community of believers, but religious in the sense of the individual standing alone before the deepest questions of his existence, in the full recognition of his own limitation and uncertainty, and making the leap anyway. These stages are not a ladder that every man climbs in sequence and reaches the top of. They are modes of existence that most men move between throughout their lives. And the question Kierkegaard is asking is not which stage you have achieved, but which relationship to commitment and uncertainty you are currently living inside. There is a text Kierkegaard wrote that is among the most challenging pieces of philosophical writing ever produced. It is called Fear and Trembling, and it is built around a single story from the Hebrew Bible. The story of Abraham and Isaac. God commands Abraham to take his son Isaac, the son he loves, the son through whom all the promises of God to Abraham are supposed to be fulfilled, and to sacrifice him on a mountain in the land of Moriah. Abraham, without explanation, without argument, without the kind of ethical reasoning that would make the command comprehensible, sets out to obey. He does not tell Sarah, he does not tell Isaac until the last possible moment. He carries the terrible knowledge alone, in silence, for 3 days of travel to the mountain, and he binds his son and raises the knife. And at the final moment, an angel intervenes, and the sacrifice does not happen, and Isaac lives and Abraham has passed the test, whatever the test was. Kierkegaard was not interested in the happy ending. He was interested in the 3 days. He was interested in what it meant to be Abraham during those 3 days. To carry something that could not be explained to anyone, that violated every ethical principle a reasonable person would endorse, that required acting in complete and agonizing uncertainty about whether the voice being obeyed was divine or delusion. To be alone with a requirement that could not be shared or justified or made to look reasonable to any observer, including yourself. He called Abraham a knight of faith, not because Abraham was certain, but because Abraham acted in the complete absence of certainty, with everything at stake, from a place so deep inside himself that it could not be reduced to ethical calculation or rational argument. That, Kierkegaard said, is what genuine faith looks like. And he meant faith in the broadest sense, not only religious faith, the faith a man has to summon when he commits to a marriage, not knowing whether it will hold, when he chooses a path, not knowing whether it will be worth what it costs, when he loves someone knowing that love makes him vulnerable in ways that cannot be managed, when he acts on what he most deeply believes to be right in the full knowledge that he might be wrong. Most men manage their exposure to uncertainty through a set of strategies so practiced and so automatic that they have stopped being visible as strategies at all. One strategy is delay, the decision that never quite gets made because there is always more information that might be useful, always another consideration that needs to be thought through, always a reason why this is not quite the right moment. Delay feels like prudence. It is often avoidance. The man who has been meaning to have a difficult conversation for 3 years is not being careful. He is being afraid. Another strategy is hedging, the commitment that is never quite full because keeping one foot back provides an exit. The relationship held at a slight distance so that if it fails, the failure is survivable. The investment of effort that stops just short of everything because everything would mean that the outcome genuinely mattered. And genuine mattering creates genuine vulnerability, and genuine vulnerability is exactly what the strategy is designed to prevent. Another strategy is substitution, replacing the choices that carry real risk with choices that look similar but carry less. committing intensely to work because work is legible and measurable, and the feedback is relatively clean, while holding back from the relationships where the feedback is ambiguous and the stakes are higher and the possibility of real loss is real. Kierkegaard would recognize all of these strategies. He would not condemn them. He understood from the inside the specific terror of genuine commitment in the absence of certainty. But he would want you to know what the strategies cost. They cost the life that only genuine commitment produces. The depth of relationship that comes from having given yourself to someone completely rather than almost. The sense of being genuinely present in your own existence rather than managing it from a careful distance. The specific kind of aliveness that comes from having leaped and found, not certainty but ground. He said that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. He did not mean that anxiety is a bad thing to be overcome. He meant that anxiety is the accurate response to the actual condition of human existence, which is the condition of a being who must choose and who knows that the choice is real and the consequences are real, and there is no authority anywhere that can make the choice for him or guarantee in advance that the choice he makes will be the right one. The anxiety a man feels before a genuine commitment is not a signal that something is wrong with him. It is a signal that the commitment is real, that the stakes are actual, that he is standing at a genuine threshold rather than a simulated one. The man who feels no anxiety before a significant choice is not more courageous than the man who does. He is either less aware of what he is about to do or less honest about what it means. Genuine courage is not the absence of anxiety. It is the decision to act in the presence of it. The anxiety you feel before you say the true thing, before you make the genuine commitment, before you step into the version of your life that requires everything you have, is not a reason to wait. It is a sign that you are close to something real. Kierkegaard believed that the most important things in a human life, love, vocation, faith, genuine selfhood, all required what he called subjectivity. He meant something specific by this word, not solipsism or self-indulgence, but the irreducibly personal nature of the most significant choices a man makes. Nobody can choose for you. Nobody can tell you, with the authority that would make it feel safe, whether the person you love is the right person, whether the life you are building is the right life, whether the thing you most deeply believe is worth the cost of acting on it. Those questions can be informed by conversation and reflection and the witness of other people's experience, but they cannot be answered by any of those things. They can only be answered by the man himself from the inside, in the act of choosing. This is terrifying. It is also the only condition under which a man's life becomes genuinely his own. The man who outsources his most important choices, who does what is expected of him, who follows the template, who waits for consensus or permission, or the kind of external validation that would make the choice feel less like a risk, that man may produce a life that looks very much like the life he wanted, but it will not feel like his, because it was not chosen, not really, not from the inside, not from the place that Kierkegaard is pointing at when he talks about the leap. Ownership of a life, genuine ownership, requires genuine choosing. And genuine choosing always happens in the dark. Before Kierkegaard leaves the witness chair, he sits quietly for a moment longer than necessary. Then he says, in the tone of a man who is not lecturing but remembering, "The most important things I ever did, I did without knowing whether they were right. I acted. I chose. I committed to things I could not prove deserved my commitment. And the life that came from that, whatever its failures and whatever its losses, was mine. It belonged to me in a way that nothing chosen for safety ever can." He stands. He looks at you with the particular expression of a man who knows something about loneliness and something about aliveness and does not pretend the two are unrelated. And he walks out. The courtroom is quiet in the specific way it gets quiet after someone has said something true. The eighth witness is already waiting. He has something to say about what happens when the leap does not land the way you hoped. Chapter 8. The question of suffering. What will you do with your pain? The eighth witness walks in slowly, not because he is old or infirm, Albert Camus was, by most accounts, one of the most physically vital men of his generation, an athlete, a swimmer, a man who moved through the world with the kind of ease that comes from being comfortable in a body. He walks slowly because he is carrying something. You can see it in the way he moves. Not dramatically, not performatively. The way a man carries something real, which is quietly, and with the particular attention of a person who has decided not to put it down. He sits in the witness chair and looks at you with eyes that contain something that is not quite sadness and not quite acceptance and is probably both at once. He says, "I am not going to tell you that your pain has a purpose." He says it without apology, without the hedging that would make it easier to hear. "I'm not going to tell you that everything happens for a reason, or that suffering makes you stronger, or that what does not kill you leaves you better equipped for the next thing. I am not going to offer you the consolation that your particular losses are secretly gains, or that the story of your pain will eventually reveal itself to have been leading somewhere worth the cost of getting there. What I'm going to ask you is harder than any of that. I'm going to ask what you are going to do with your pain, given that it is real, given that it is yours, given that no explanation will undo it, and given that the life you are still living is waiting for your answer." Albert Camus was born in 1913 in Mondovi, Algeria, into a poverty that was not romantic or picturesque, but simply hard. His father was killed at the Battle of the Marne when Camus was less than a year old. He grew up in a two-room apartment in the working-class district of Belcourt in Algiers with his mother, his brother, his grandmother, and an uncle. His mother was illiterate, partially deaf, and largely silent. She communicated very little of her interior life to her children, not because she was cold, but because the vocabulary for it was not available to her, and because the life she was living did not leave much room for the kind of emotional expression that requires safety and time. Camus loved her with a depth and a complexity that he spent his entire career trying to find language for. He died in a car accident on a road in Provence in January 1960 at 46. In his coat pocket was an unused train ticket. He had planned to take the train and changed his mind at the last moment. He was a man who understood, from a very early age and from very direct personal experience, that life does not distribute its difficulties according to merit or desert, that the good suffer and the innocent are taken and the careful are not always protected, and that the only available response to that truth is the one a man chooses to make. The concept at the center of Camus's thought is what he called the absurd. He did not mean absurd in the casual sense of something ridiculous or incongruous. He meant something more precise and more foundational. He meant the fundamental collision between two things that are both undeniably true and completely irreconcilable. The first is the human need for meaning, the need to understand, to find pattern and purpose and coherence in experience, to feel that what we do matters and that the losses we suffer are not simply arbitrary and the choices we make are not simply noise. This need is not optional. It is structural. It is part of what it means to be a human being rather than something else. We cannot stop needing it any more than we can stop needing air. The second is the silence of the world in response to that need. The universe does not confirm meaning. It does not organize itself around human requirements or respond to human suffering with explanation or reassurance. It simply continues, indifferent, proceeding according to forces that have nothing to do with what any particular human being deserves or needs or has been through. The absurd is not either of these things alone. It is the collision between them. The experience of being a creature who requires meaning, living in a world that does not provide it, and having to decide what to do about that. Camus believed there were three possible responses to the absurd. The first was physical suicide. The decision that if life cannot provide the meaning it seems to require, life is not worth continuing. Camus rejected this not on moral grounds, but on what he considered logical ones. It was, in his view, a surrender to the absurd rather than a response to it. It resolved the tension by eliminating one of the two things in collision, and what it eliminated was the one thing that was actually yours. The second was what he called philosophical suicide. the leap into a belief system that resolved the absurd by declaring that meaning existed after all, that the silence of the world was not silence but the speech of something too large to hear clearly. Religious faith, in Camus' view, was the most common form of this response. He did not condemn it exactly, but he did not accept it for himself, because he believed it required a kind of dishonesty about what was actually there. The third response was the one Camus chose. He called it revolt, not political revolt, not the overthrow of anything external, the interior decision to live fully and honestly in the full awareness of the absurd, to refuse the consolations that would make it more bearable by making it less true, and to find in that refusal a kind of freedom and a kind of dignity that the other two responses made impossible. He imagined Sisyphus happy. Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. Each time he neared the summit, the boulder rolled back down. He descended to push it up again. It rolled back down, forever. Camus looked at it and said, one must imagine Sisyphus happy, not resigned, not broken into a flat acceptance that does not feel like anything. Happy. In the specific sense of a man who has looked at his condition with full clarity, without illusion, without the consolation of a story that makes it mean something it does not mean, and who has decided to inhabit it fully anyway. Who has made the boulder his. Who has, in the descent back down the hill, in the moment between one push and the next, found something that belongs entirely to him and cannot be taken by the gods or the futility or the eternal repetition. That something is consciousness, the awareness of his own condition, the refusal to be reduced to it. And revolt, in Camus' view, is the only response to suffering that preserves the full dignity of the person who is suffering. Most men have developed a relationship to their own pain that is worth examining in the light of what Camus is describing. The most common relationship is management. Pain arrives, and the man manages it. He finds somewhere to put it so that it does not interfere too much with the functioning of the rest of his life. He develops strategies for keeping it contained. He learns how much of it he can carry and still operate at the level the world requires of him, and he calibrates accordingly. This is not nothing. The capacity to continue functioning in the presence of real pain is a genuine human capacity, and in many situations a necessary one. A man does not stop being a father because he is grieving. The problem is when management becomes the permanent condition. When the pain that was supposed to be carried while other things got attended to is still being carried 20 years later, not because it has not been addressed, but because addressing it was never quite the right moment, never quite safe enough or convenient enough or far enough removed from the demands of everything else. That pain does not stay in the container indefinitely. It finds other forms. It becomes the anger that arrives in situations that do not fully account for its intensity. It becomes the distance in relationships that the man cannot quite explain and cannot quite close. It becomes the exhaustion that sleep does not fix, and the restlessness that activity does not resolve, and the flat quality that settles over a life that has been managed for long enough that it has stopped being fully inhabited. Camus would recognize that condition. He would not tell you to feel your pain more dramatically, or to perform grief in ways that do not belong to you. He would ask something quieter and more demanding. He would ask whether you have been honest with yourself about what you are actually carrying. There is a particular kind of suffering that men tend to find most difficult to acknowledge, which is the suffering that comes from their own choices. The loss that was not visited upon you from outside, but that you participated in creating. The relationship that ended in a way you could have prevented if you had been different in ways you were capable of being different but chose not to be. The opportunity that closed because of something you did or failed to do. The version of your life that was available and that you let go of, not because it was taken from you, but because you were not yet the man it required. That suffering carries a specific weight because it comes attached to accountability. And accountability in the context of pain is one of the things men find most difficult to hold without either defending against it entirely or collapsing under it. Camus is asking you to hold it without doing either. Not to defend against it, by insisting that the losses were inevitable, and not to collapse under it in the way that self-recrimination can become its own evasion, a performance of accountability that actually forecloses the genuine reckoning it appears to offer. The man who punishes himself endlessly for what he did wrong is not necessarily more honest than the man who defends against it. He may simply be substituting suffering for accountability, mistaking the feeling of guilt for the work of genuine examination. What Camus is pointing at is something between those two responses. The willingness to look at what happened, including your part in it, with full clarity and without the distortions that make it either more bearable or more dramatic than it actually was. To see it as it was, to acknowledge what it cost, to allow that acknowledgement to be real rather than performed, and then to ask, from that place of genuine honesty, what you are going to do with the rest of the life you still have. Before Camus leaves the witness chair, he does something that fits him in the way that everything about him fits him, which is to say naturally, without ceremony, without the performance of profundity. He looks at you for a moment. Then he says, the only question that matters is whether you are going to be fully present in the life you actually have, or whether you are going to spend it waiting for a different one. He says it quietly. He does not say it as a judgment. He says it as a man who asked himself the same question every day for his entire life, and who found that asking it was not the same as answering it once and moving on, but that it required the same answer again the next day and the day after that. He stands, he looks briefly toward the door, toward the light coming through it, and he walks out. The courtroom is very still. The ninth witness is going to ask about the part of all of this that a man most wants to avoid looking at, the part he has been looking away from the longest. Before the ninth witness enters, the court asks one more thing. What are you not yet willing to look at directly? What pain have you been managing rather than acknowledging? What loss have you been explaining rather than feeling? And this, have you ever mistaken the feeling of guilt for the work of genuine examination? Have you ever substituted suffering for accountability, treating the feeling of remorse as though it were the same thing as the reckoning it appeared to offer? The man who punishes himself endlessly for what he did wrong is not necessarily more honest than the man who defends against it. He may simply be substituting one evasion for another. The ninth witness is going to ask whether some of what you call your pain is actually something you have been refusing to see about yourself. Whether the thing that most reliably disturbs you in other people has something to tell you about what you have put in the dark. The ninth witness enters. Chapter 9. The question of the shadow. What part of yourself are you refusing to see? The ninth witness enters quietly. Carl Jung does not announce himself. He does not carry the street-worn plainness of Socrates, or the charged intensity of Nietzsche, or the precise punctuality of Kant. He moves through the courtroom the way a man moves through a space he has spent a long time studying, with the particular attention of someone who knows that what is visible on the surface is rarely the most important thing in the room. He was a Swiss psychiatrist who spent his career doing something that most of his contemporaries found either brilliant or unsettling, and often both at once. He listened, not just to what his patients said, but to what they did not say, to what appeared in their dreams, to the patterns that ran beneath the surface of conscious thought and organized behavior, in ways that the person exhibiting the behavior could not always see or explain. He believed that the human psyche was vastly larger than the portion of it that any given person had conscious access to, and that the parts outside conscious awareness were not inert. They were active. They were shaping things, and ignoring them did not make them less powerful. It made them more so. He sits down in the witness chair and looks at you with the steady attention of a man who is not in a hurry and who is not easily deceived. He says, I want to talk to you about the part of yourself you have decided does not exist. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in Keswil, Switzerland, the son of a Protestant minister whose own faith was troubled and whose struggles with belief left a permanent mark on his son. Jung grew up in a household where the official religious framework and the lived emotional reality were not always the same thing, and where the gap between what was said and what was actually felt was something a perceptive child could not help but notice. He trained in medicine and psychiatry and built, over the course of his career, a psychology of considerable scope that attended to the full range of human symbolic and mythological experience alongside the clinical work. What belongs in this chapter is the concept he called the shadow. The shadow, in Jung's psychology, is the part of the self that has been rejected, not rejected consciously in most cases, not deliberately set aside after careful consideration, rejected in the way that things get rejected in childhood, through the accumulated pressure of what was rewarded and what was punished, what was permitted and what was not, what the people around a developing child required him to be, and what they required him not to be. Every child begins with the full range of human possibility, the capacity for generosity and for cruelty, for courage and for cowardice, for tenderness and for rage, for honesty and for deception. All of it is present at the beginning, not as character, but as potential, as the raw material from which a particular person will eventually be formed. The process of formation requires selection. The child learns, through thousands of small experiences of approval and disapproval, which parts of himself are acceptable and which are not. The parts that are acceptable get developed, practiced, integrated into the conscious identity, into the person the child learns to present to the world and eventually to understand as himself. The parts that are not acceptable get pushed away, down, out of the light of conscious awareness and into the region Jung called the shadow. But they do not disappear. They continue to exist in the shadow, accumulated over years, still containing their original energy, still wanting expression, still exerting pressure on the conscious self from underneath. And because the conscious self has decided they do not exist, because the man has organized his identity around not being the things in the shadow, the pressure they exert tends to emerge sideways, in distorted forms, in the places and moments where the conscious control that keeps them contained is weakest. Jung believed that understanding the shadow was not optional for a man who wanted to live with genuine self-knowledge. It was the work. The unavoidable, uncomfortable, lifelong work of a person who was serious about becoming who they actually were. The most reliable indicator of shadow material is not introspection. It is reaction. The things that produce in you a disproportionate emotional response, the people who trigger you most reliably, the behaviors in others that generate the most intense irritation or contempt or moral outrage, these are almost always pointing at something in the shadow. Not because the trigger is imaginary. The thing you are reacting to may be genuinely objectionable. But the intensity of the reaction, the specific charge it carries, the way it seems to reach into you further than the situation fully accounts for, that is the shadow speaking. Jung called this projection, the psychological mechanism by which a person attributes to someone else a quality they cannot acknowledge in themselves. The man who is most loudly contemptuous of weakness in other people is very often carrying a great deal of unacknowledged fear. The man who is most reliably outraged by dishonesty in others has very often developed considerable skill at deceiving himself. The man who cannot tolerate arrogance in the people around him may be managing a significant quantity of his own. This is not a comfortable observation. It is also not an absolute one. Not every strong reaction is projection. Sometimes a thing is genuinely objectionable, and the strong reaction is simply an appropriate response to something that deserves one. The question Jung is asking is not whether your reaction is always projection. It is whether you are willing to sit with the possibility that some of your strongest reactions are telling you something about yourself, rather than only about the person who triggered them. That willingness is what distinguishes the man who is doing the shadow work from the man who is not. There is a particular form of shadow material that is worth examining directly because it is so common in men and so consistently overlooked. The shadow does not only contain what is dark in the conventional sense. It does not only contain the rage or the cruelty or the selfishness that a man has been taught are unacceptable and has therefore pushed out of conscious awareness. It also contains what is positive, what is tender, what is genuinely good in a man, that the template told him was unacceptable for a different reason. The capacity for vulnerability, for open affection, for the expression of need, for the kind of tenderness toward the people he loves that does not perform strength but simply offers presence, for the grief that belongs to him but that the template told him had no legitimate place in the life of a man who was supposed to be solid and capable and not undone by things. That material is in the shadow too, and its suppression costs as much as the suppression of the darker material, perhaps more, because what it costs tends to be paid by the people who most need what is being suppressed. The partner who cannot reach him, the child who senses a father present in the room but not quite available to be landed on, the friendship that has depth but not the specific kind of depth that would require him to let someone see the parts of himself that live in the shadow. Jung called the positive shadow the golden shadow, and he believed its retrieval was as important as the acknowledgement of the darker material. Not because the darkness should be acted on, but because the gold, the genuine warmth and vulnerability and tenderness that has been stored in the shadow, belongs in the world. It belongs in the man's relationships. It belongs in his life. It has been kept from them long enough. Jung described a process he called individuation, which was his term for the lifelong project of becoming who you actually are, as distinct from the persona, the mask, the socially adapted version of yourself that you have developed for external consumption. Every person needs a persona. The ability to adapt your presentation to different social contexts, to be appropriately professional in professional settings and appropriately informal in informal ones, to understand what a given situation requires and to provide it, this is a genuine and necessary human capacity. The problem is when the persona and the self become so thoroughly confused that the man can no longer tell the difference between the face he shows the world and the person underneath it. The man who has been performing a version of himself for long enough that the performance feels like identity is a man who has lost access to himself in a very specific and very costly way. He may be successful by every external measure. He may be well-regarded, well-functioning, capable and competent, and apparently at ease in the world. And underneath all of that, there is a persistent sense of something missing, of a life being lived at a slight remove from what it could be, of a fullness that is visible at the edges of experience but never quite available at the center. Individuation is the process of recovering the person underneath. Not in one dramatic moment of revelation, not in a single confrontation with the shadow that resolves everything cleanly, but through the continuous and often uncomfortable work of attending to what is actually present in the interior, of noticing the projections and following them back, of asking what the things that trigger you most reliably are telling you about the parts of yourself you have not yet been willing to acknowledge. It is a project that runs for a lifetime. There is a specific way the shadow tends to operate in the closest relationships of a man's life, and it is worth examining here because it is where the shadow does its most consequential work. The people we are most intimate with have a particular capacity to activate the shadow, not because they are trying to, not because there is anything deliberately provocative about what they are doing, but because intimacy reduces the distance that normally keeps the shadow contained, and the material in the shadow, when the distance is reduced, finds its way into the space between two people. A man who has suppressed his own vulnerability will find the vulnerability of the people he loves difficult to be with. Not because he is cruel or indifferent, but because their vulnerability activates his own, which is exactly the thing he has been working for years to keep contained, and the activation is uncomfortable, and discomfort generates distance, and the distance that is generated is experienced by the other person as withdrawal or rejection, even when it is actually just a man managing his shadow. A man who has suppressed his own need for recognition will find it difficult to give recognition freely to the people around him. Because giving it freely requires acknowledging the need, and acknowledging the need requires that he visit the part of himself where the need lives, which is the shadow, which is the place he has organized his life around, not visiting. A man who has suppressed his own fear will find the fear of the people he loves either invisible or contemptible, because to see it clearly would require acknowledging his own, and his own is in the shadow where it has been for as long as he can remember. The shadow, in other words, does not only affect the man who carries it. It affects everyone close enough to be touched by its edges. He said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. He did not mean that the darkness should be celebrated or indulged or acted upon. He meant that the darkness that is not made conscious does not become less dark. It becomes less visible, which is not the same thing. And what is less visible is also less controllable, because you cannot govern what you cannot see. And the shadow material that remains in the shadow continues to operate, continues to shape behavior and perception and relationship, continues to find its way into the world through the back door of projection and unconscious enactment, regardless of how firmly the front door is kept shut. Making the darkness conscious does not mean that the darkness gets to run the house. It means that the man who owns the house finally knows what is in all the rooms. That knowledge is not pleasant. It is not supposed to be. The shadow contains things a man has kept in the dark for reasons that made sense at the time, and looking at them directly requires a tolerance for discomfort that is genuinely demanding. There will be things there that he would prefer not to see, things that complicate the version of himself he has carefully assembled. Things that require him to revise his understanding of why he has done what he has done, and felt what he has felt, and been what he has been. But the man who has done that looking, who has sat with what he found there long enough to integrate it rather than resuppress it, who has made his peace with the full complexity of what he is, rather than the simplified version he was taught to present, that man has access to a solidity and a genuineness that the unexamined man does not. He is harder to manipulate, because he is not defending against the exposure of something he has already acknowledged. He is more capable of genuine intimacy, because he is not keeping people at the distance required to protect the shadow from being seen. He is less likely to be blindsided by his own behavior, because he has developed the habit of attending to what is actually happening in the interior rather than managing the surface. He is, in the deepest sense of the word, more honest. Not with other people, necessarily, though that often follows, with himself. Before Jung leaves the witness chair, he asks the question he has been building toward since he walked in. He asks it quietly, without drama, in the tone of a man who has spent his career sitting with people in the presence of exactly this question, and who knows that the asking is the beginning of something rather than the end of it. What is the thing about yourself that you would be most reluctant to have the people who love you know? Not the most dramatic thing, not the thing that would produce the most external consequence if it became known. The thing whose acknowledgement would require the greatest revision of the story you tell about yourself. The thing that lives in the room you do not open, because opening it would mean that certain other things you have built on top of it would have to be reconsidered. That thing is not your worst self. It is part of your whole self. And the wholeness is what this courtroom has been building toward from the beginning. He stands, he walks out without ceremony. In the same quiet way he came in, the courtroom is still. The 10th witness is going to step back from the interior and ask about something that lives between a man and the world around him. He is going to ask how much of the life you are living actually belongs to you. Before the 10th witness enters, the court asks you to think about the people who shaped you, not the ones you acknowledge easily, not the teachers who encouraged you or the mentors who believed in you. Think about the people who shaped you in the ways that are harder to account for. The person whose approval you are still seeking, though they may no longer be alive to give it. The person whose disapproval you organized your life around avoiding long after you were old enough to no longer need their approval. The person who modeled something you swore you would never become, and who you have, in specific moments, recognized in yourself with a shock of recognition that you quickly filed somewhere you would not have to look at it again. the person who hurt you in a way you have never fully processed, and whose influence on the way you move through the world has therefore remained invisible to you, even as it has remained active. The people who shaped us most deeply are not always the ones we talk about most. The ones we talk about most are often the ones we have already processed enough to narrate. The ones who shaped us most are sometimes the ones we have the least language for. The 10th witness is about to ask what we do with what we inherit from the world we did not choose. She enters now. The question of belonging. How much of your life belongs to you? The 10th witness enters the courtroom with a quality of alertness that is different from the alertness of the previous witnesses. Hannah Arendt notices things, not in the way that Socrates noticed the gaps in a man's reasoning or Jung noticed the patterns beneath conscious behavior. She notices the world, the specific, concrete, political, social world that human beings construct together, and inside of which every individual life is lived, whether that individual is aware of it or not. She was a political philosopher, in the deepest sense of the word, which means she was a philosopher who refused to treat the human being as an abstraction, separable from the conditions of the world he inhabits, from the communities that shaped him, from the structures of power and belonging and exclusion that determine, more than most men realize, the contours of what feels possible and what feels unthinkable. She sits down in the witness chair and looks at you with the particular attention of a person who has thought carefully about what it costs a human being to think for themselves in a world that would prefer they did not. She asks, how much of what you believe did you actually choose? Not the large things. Not the political positions or the philosophical commitments or the explicit values you would name if someone asked you directly what you stood for. The small things. The things so embedded in the texture of your daily life that they have stopped presenting themselves as choices at all. The assumptions about how the world works and what a man is supposed to want and what success looks like and what kind of life is worth living that arrived so early and were reinforced so consistently that they feel not like beliefs but like facts. How much of that is yours? And how much of it is simply the air of the particular room you have been breathing for as long as you can remember? Hannah Arendt was born in 1906 in Linden, Germany, to a secular Jewish family, and her life was shaped at every significant turn by the collision between the world of ideas she inhabited and the political catastrophes of the 20th century that repeatedly invaded and transformed that world. She studied philosophy at Marburg under Martin Heidegger, with whom she had a complicated and much discussed romantic relationship, and later under Karl Jaspers in Heidelberg. She was completing her doctoral dissertation when the National Socialists came to power in 1933. She was arrested by the Gestapo, held briefly, released, and fled Germany. She spent years stateless, living in Paris, working for Jewish refugee organizations, before fleeing again in 1941 to the United States, where she eventually became one of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century. Her most famous work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in 1951, was an attempt to understand how the most educated, cultured, philosophically sophisticated civilization in the Western world had produced the Holocaust. Not as an aberration, not as the work of a small number of uniquely evil men, but as the product of specific social and political conditions, specific failures of thinking, specific ways in which ordinary human beings had allowed themselves to stop thinking for themselves and had surrendered their individual judgment to the momentum of the collective. That question, how ordinary people stop thinking for themselves and what it costs when they do, is the one she carries into this courtroom. Arendt made a distinction that is central to this chapter between what she called the public realm and the private realm, and between the specific dangers that arise when the boundary between them collapses. The public realm in her thinking is the shared world, the space between people. The domain of action and speech where human beings appear to one another as distinct individuals, where they take positions and make arguments and are held accountable for what they say and do. It is the realm of genuine plurality, of the irreducible difference between human beings that makes genuine politics possible, the realm where the fact that you and I see things differently is not a problem to be resolved, but a condition to be honored. The private realm is the space of withdrawal, of interiority, of the life that does not present itself to others, but that belongs to the person alone, the domain of genuine thought, of the conversation a man has with himself, of the things he values and questions and works through in the silence of his own mind. Both realms are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. The man who lives entirely in the public realm, who has no private life in the genuine sense, no interior that is genuinely his own, and genuinely protected from the demands of other people's expectations, is a man who has given himself over to the world in a way that eventually hollows him out. He becomes a function of what other people see and expect and require. He loses the capacity for the kind of independent thought that requires a certain protected distance from the noise of other people's opinions. The man who retreats entirely into the private realm, who withdraws from the shared world and its demands and its difficulties, is a man who has abdicated the specifically human responsibility of appearing in the world as a distinct person with distinct positions and distinct accountability for what he does and says. The question Arendt is asking is not which realm you inhabit. It is whether you have preserved the genuine distinction between them. Whether the private self, the one who thinks for himself in the quiet of his own interior, is actually shaping the public self, the one who appears in the world, or whether the relationship has been reversed, whether the demands and expectations and pressures of the public realm have so thoroughly colonized the interior that there is no longer a genuinely private self left to do the shaping. Arendt wrote about a concept she called the banality of evil, and it is one of the most misunderstood phrases in the history of 20th century thought. She coined it in her report on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust, whom she observed in Jerusalem in 1961. She was expecting a monster. What she found was something she considered far more disturbing. A man who was, by all appearances, ordinary, bureaucratic, focused on doing his job efficiently, neither ideologically fanatical in any deep sense, nor possessed of the kind of dramatic sadism that would have made him easier to understand as an exceptional case. What Eichmann lacked, in Arendt's assessment, was not conscience in the conventional sense. What he lacked was thought. The capacity and the willingness to stop and think from his own position, to ask what he was actually doing and what it meant and whether it was right, rather than simply executing the requirements of the role he had been given within the system he had joined. He had surrendered his individual judgment to the momentum of the collective. He had allowed the structure he was inside to do his thinking for him. And the result, in the specific historical conditions of the Third Reich, was participation in one of the greatest crimes in human history, not through exceptional malevolence, but through the ordinary, banal failure to think. Arendt was not saying that Eichmann bore no responsibility. She was saying that his case illustrated something important and disturbing about the specific danger of the failure to think, the failure to maintain the kind of independent judgment that belongs to a person rather than a role, that originates in a genuine private self, rather than in the requirements of whatever structure a man finds himself inside. That failure is not limited to totalitarian systems. It is available in every human life, in every institution, in every community, in every marriage and family and workplace, where the pressure to conform to what is expected is strong enough and the habit of independent thought is weak enough that a man can find himself, years into a life, acting in ways that the genuine private self, if it were consulted, would not endorse. Most men belong to multiple tribes simultaneously, and the belonging is not always consciously chosen. There is the tribe of origin, the family and community and culture you were born into, with its specific values and specific definitions of success, and specific ideas about what a man is and what a man does and what a man does not do. There is the tribe of peers, the men you have moved through life alongside, whose opinions and whose judgments you have absorbed so thoroughly that you can predict what they would say about most of your choices without asking them. There is the tribe of profession with its specific culture and specific hierarchies and specific definitions of what counts as achievement and what counts as failure. There is the tribe of political identity, of regional identity, of generational identity, each carrying its own set of assumptions that present themselves not as tribal positions but as obvious truths. Every man is shaped by his tribes. That shaping is not the problem. The problem is when the shaping has been so complete and the individual's capacity for independent thought so underdeveloped or so thoroughly subordinated to the demands of belonging that the man can no longer tell the difference between what he actually believes and what the tribe has taught him to believe. That distinction between genuine belief and tribal inheritance is the one Arendt cares about most. Not because tribal belonging is bad. Human beings need to belong. The need is real, and the communities that meet it are genuinely valuable. But the man who has never examined his belonging, who has never asked which of the tribe's beliefs he has genuinely adopted and which he has simply absorbed because the cost of not absorbing them was too high, is a man who is not fully the author of his own life. He is carrying out instructions he did not write. And the danger Arendt is pointing at is not that this produces obvious harm in ordinary circumstances. In ordinary circumstances, it is almost invisible. The danger is what happens when the tribe's instructions begin to move in a direction that the genuine private self, the one that still thinks for itself, would not endorse, and the man has no practice of independent judgment to draw on, no habit of asking whether what the tribe requires is actually what is right. At that point, the failure to think becomes something more than a personal limitation. Most men do not have much practice with the internal dialogue that genuine judgment requires, not because they are incapable of it, but because the conditions of modern life do not encourage it and sometimes actively work against it. The constant availability of other people's opinions, the specific social pressure of environments that reward quick and confident alignment with the tribe's positions and punish the hesitation of genuine independent thought, the sheer busyness of lives organized around doing rather than thinking, all of these create conditions in which that dialogue has very little room to operate. The result is not stupidity. It is something more specific and more concerning. It is the condition of a man who is intelligent and articulate and capable of sophisticated argument in the service of positions he has never genuinely examined, whose confidence in his views is not the confidence of a man who has thought carefully and arrived at a considered position, but the confidence of a man who has absorbed his tribe's certainties so thoroughly that they feel like his own. Arendt would want you to ask, honestly, whether the things you are most certain about are the things you have thought about most carefully, or whether they are the things the tribe was most certain about when you were learning what certainty looked like. Arendt believed that the capacity to begin something new was the most distinctively human of all human capacities. She called it natality, the fact of having been born, which for Arendt meant not just the biological event, but the ongoing human capacity to initiate, to bring something new into the world, to act in ways that are not simply the continuation of existing patterns, but genuine departures from them. Every human being, in Arendt's view, represents a beginning, not because every human action is original in some dramatic sense, but because the capacity to act, to initiate, to choose something different from what the existing momentum of circumstances would produce if left uninterrupted, is always available. It is never fully foreclosed by habit or history or the weight of everything that came before. This is not a comfortable thought for a man who has spent years inside a life that has been shaped by pressures he did not always choose and that has moved in directions he did not always intend. It asks something of him. It asks him to acknowledge that the capacity to begin again is not something that was available at 20 and is no longer available now. It is structurally available, always. To every person who is still alive and still capable of thought and still capable of the kind of independent judgment that genuine action requires. The question is not whether the capacity is there, the question is whether the man is willing to use it. Before Arendt leaves the witness chair, she says something that is characteristic of her in the best sense, direct, unsparing, grounded in the specific rather than the abstract. She says, "The greatest danger to a human life is not suffering, and it is not loss. It is thoughtlessness. The condition of a man who moves through his life executing the requirements of the roles he occupies and the tribes he belongs to without ever stopping to ask, from his own position, from the place where the genuine private self lives, whether what he is doing is what he would choose if he were actually choosing." She does not say this to condemn. She says it as a woman who spent her life watching what happens when thinking stops, who understood from direct and terrible experience what the failure of individual judgment costs, not just the person who fails to think, but the people whose lives are touched by that failure. She looks at you for a moment. Then she says, "You are still thinking. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything." She stands, she gathers herself with the specific composure of a woman who has survived things that required composure and who has learned to carry it without pretending it was free, and she walks out. The courtroom is quiet in the way it gets quiet when something important has just been named. The 11th witness is going to bring all of this, the thinking and the examining and the shadow work and the courage and the belonging, into the place where it matters most. He is going to ask about love. Chapter 11. The question of love. Do the people you love flourish because of you? The 11th witness chair holds 3 men. This has not happened before in this courtroom. The previous witnesses came alone, each carrying a single question, each examining a specific face of what it means to be a human being moving through a human life with honesty and intention. But love resists the single perspective. It is too large and too various and too consequential to be held by one philosopher's framing alone. And so 3 men sit in the witness chair together, not arguing with each other, not competing for primacy, but offering their distinct angles on the same enormous question. They look at you together, and they ask, in the specific way that 3 thinkers with different angles on the same truth ask a question, something that sounds simple and is not. Do the people you love flourish because of you? Not do you love them. Not do you feel love for them. Not do you intend well toward them. Not do you sacrifice for them or provide for them or stay when leaving would be easier. Do they flourish? Does your presence in their lives, the specific way you love them, the specific form your love takes in the ordinary texture of your daily interactions with them, does it contribute to their becoming more fully who they are? That question sits in the room for a moment before anyone speaks. Aristotle speaks first, because Aristotle always moves from the concrete. He has appeared in this courtroom before, in chapter 3, where he asked about the habits that form a man's character. He returns here because he believed that friendship and love were not peripheral to the good life, but central to it, and that the specific quality of a man's closest relationships was both evidence of his character and the primary arena in which character was developed and tested. He distinguished, in his Nicomachean Ethics, between 3 kinds of friendship, and the distinction is worth examining carefully because it maps the territory of human relationship with more precision than most modern thinking about love manages to achieve. The first kind he called friendship of utility. 2 people who are useful to each other. Business partners, colleagues, the acquaintances whose company you enjoy because they serve some practical purpose in your life, and whose company you would not seek if they ceased to serve it. There is nothing wrong with this kind of friendship. It is real and it has genuine value. But it is also contingent. It lasts as long as the utility does, and it does not require the kind of genuine attention to the other person as a person, rather than as a function, that deeper friendship requires. The second kind he called friendship of pleasure. 2 people who enjoy each other's company, who are amusing to each other, stimulating to each other, who make each other feel good in ways that do not require deep knowledge of each other's interior life. Again, real and genuinely valuable, and again, contingent. It lasts as long as the pleasure does. The third kind he called friendship of virtue. 2 people who know each other genuinely, who are present to each other's actual character rather than to the function they serve or the pleasure they provide, who wish each other well, not instrumentally, but for the other person's own sake. and whose relationship deepens over time because it is rooted in something more durable than utility or pleasure. This is what Aristotle meant by love in its fullest sense, and he believed it was rare. Not because human beings are incapable of it, but because it requires something that most people find demanding. It requires genuine attention to another person's actual interior life, rather than to the version of them that serves your needs or confirms your existing understanding of who they are. It requires the willingness to be changed by your knowledge of another person, to allow genuine closeness to complicate and enrich your understanding of both of them and yourself. It requires time and continuity and the specific kind of investment that only becomes possible when you have decided that this particular person and your relationship with them matters enough to keep showing up for. Aristotle would ask you to think about the people you call your closest loves. Are you present to who they actually are? Not who they were when you first knew them, not the version of them that is most comfortable or most consistent with your own needs, but who they are now, in the specific and continuing reality of their actual interior life. Because love of the kind Aristotle valued is not a state you arrive at and maintain through inertia. It is an ongoing act of attention, and the attention either continues or it stops. And when it stops, what remains may still be called love, but it has become something else, something more like the residue of love, a habit of proximity and obligation that has lost the genuine attentiveness that made it the real thing. Kierkegaard leans forward now because this is the territory he has been waiting for. He has appeared in this courtroom before, in chapter 7, where he asked about courage in the face of uncertainty. He returns here because he believed that love was the most extreme form of the leap, the commitment that required more genuine courage than any other human undertaking, and that the failure to understand this was responsible for a great deal of the disappointment and the distance that settles into relationships over time. He made a distinction in his writing between what he called erotic love and the love that is chosen, maintained, practiced, returned to again and again through acts of deliberate commitment that have nothing to do with how the person feels in any given moment. The spontaneous love is real. Kierkegaard was not dismissing it. The feelings that arrive at the beginning of a significant relationship, the sense of recognition, the specific aliveness that another person can produce, the way certain people open something in us that most people do not reach, all of that is real, and it matters, and it is not nothing. But it is not sufficient, because feelings change. The aliveness of early love is not a steady state. It has a natural history, and that history includes periods that do not feel like love in the way the beginning felt like love, periods of difficulty and distance, and the specific flatness that settles over a relationship that has become familiar without becoming deeper. And the man who has understood love primarily as a feeling will experience those periods as evidence that the love has ended, as a signal to disengage or to look for the feeling elsewhere, because the feeling is what he understands love to be. Kierkegaard would say that is the confusion that costs the most. The feeling is the beginning of love, the choice to continue, to return, to show up again the next day and the day after that in the full absence of the feeling, to treat the person in front of you with the care and attention that genuine love requires, even when you do not feel like it. That is love in the sense that matters most. Not instead of the feeling, in addition to it and underneath it, and available in the periods when the feeling is not. This is what the leap looks like inside a relationship. Not the dramatic leap of beginning, the daily, undramatic, unglamorous leap of continuation, of choosing again, of deciding again that this person and this relationship are worth what they cost, not because the calculation produces a surplus, but because you have committed to something larger than any individual calculation. Kierkegaard would ask you to think about where in your closest relationships you have stopped leaping, not where the feeling has diminished. Feelings are not within your control. Where you have stopped choosing, where you have allowed the relationship to exist on the basis of momentum and obligation and the accumulated weight of shared history without the ongoing act of genuine commitment that keeps it alive as something more than the sum of its history. That stopping is not always dramatic. It often happens gradually, in small withdrawals, in the slight but consistent redirection of attention away from the relationship and toward things that are less demanding and more immediately rewarding. And by the time the distance is large enough to be undeniable, the man inside it has often lost the thread of when and how it happened. Kierkegaard would say the thread can be picked up again, but only by the man who is willing to leap. Fromm speaks last, and what he says is in some ways the most direct of the three. Erich Fromm was born in Frankfurt in 1900, trained as a psychoanalyst, fled Germany in 1934, and spent much of his career examining the ways in which modern Western society systematically undermined the conditions under which genuine love was possible. His most famous book, The Art of Loving, published in 1956, begins with a premise that most people find surprising and some find offensive. He says that most people in Western culture believe the problem of love is primarily the problem of being loved rather than the problem of loving. That what people want is to be loved, and what they are therefore working on is how to make themselves more lovable, more attractive, more successful, more interesting, more worthy of the love they want to receive. Fromm says that this is the wrong problem. Love, in his view, is not primarily something you receive. It is something you do. It is an activity, a practice, a set of capacities that must be developed through effort and attention in the same way that any other human capacity is developed. And the man who has spent his life waiting to receive love, who has organized his emotional life around the question of whether he is loved, rather than around the question of whether he is capable of loving, has missed the most fundamental thing about what love actually is and what it actually requires. He identified 4 components of genuine love, and they are worth sitting with individually. The first is care, genuine concern for the life and growth of the person you love. Not care in the sense of anxiety or possessiveness, or the need to manage the other person's experience so that it conforms to your idea of what is good for them, but care in the sense of genuine investment in their flourishing, in their becoming more fully who they are, which may sometimes look different from what you would choose for them if you were choosing on their behalf. The second is responsibility, not obligation in the legal or contractual sense, but the willingness to respond to the needs of the person you love, to notice what they need and to take it seriously enough to act. This requires the kind of attentiveness that Aristotle was describing, the ongoing genuine presence to who the person actually is, rather than who you imagine them to be, or who it would be convenient for them to be. The third is respect. In Fromm's usage, respect means the ability to see a person as they are, to be aware of their individuality, to resist the temptation to reduce them to a function in your life, or a character in your story, or a reflection of your own needs and anxieties and projections. It means allowing them to be who they are in all the complexity and inconvenience and genuine otherness that actually knowing another person requires. The fourth is knowledge. Not knowledge in the intellectual sense, but the kind of knowing that comes from genuine attention over time. The kind that is always incomplete, always in progress, always discovering something new, because the person you love is not a fixed object, but a continuing process of becoming. And genuine knowledge of them requires that you keep paying attention rather than substituting what you learned about them 10 years ago for what is actually present in them now. Fromm would ask you to evaluate honestly not whether you love, but how you love. Whether the love you offer the people closest to you contains all 4 of these elements, or whether it contains some and not others. Whether what you call love is the kind that contributes to the other person's flourishing, or whether it is the kind that, however sincere in its feeling, is primarily organized around your own needs. That distinction is not a judgment, it is a question, and it is one of the most important questions in this courtroom. The man who loves well is not the man who feels love most intensely. He is the man who has developed, through practice and attention, and the ongoing willingness to be changed by genuine closeness, the capacity to see the people he loves clearly, to wish for their flourishing genuinely rather than instrumentally, and to act from that wish consistently, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life, regardless of what he feels on any given day. That man is not born, he is built. Built through the same process of deliberate practice that Aristotle described when he talked about the formation of character. Built through the same courage that Kierkegaard described when he talked about the leap. Built through the same honest self-examination that all the previous witnesses have been asking for. The question is not whether you love, it is what your love actually does to the people who live inside it. The three witnesses stand together. Aristotle gives you the nod of a man who has said what needed to be said and trusts you to do something with it. Kierkegaard looks at you for a moment with the expression of a man who knows something about what it costs to love genuinely and who does not pretend the cost is small. Fromm says quietly, one last thing. He says, love is not a feeling that happens to you. It is a decision you make every day about who matters and how you will show up for them. And that decision, made consistently and honestly over the course of a life, is the closest thing to meaning that most human beings will ever find. They walk out together. The courtroom is very still. There are 2 witnesses left. They are going to ask about time. 11 witnesses have now testified. The 3 who appeared together asked something that discipline alone cannot answer. They asked whether the people you love flourish because of you. That question does not permit evasion through intelligence or effort, or even genuine honesty about your own interior. It requires turning the examination outward toward the specific people who have been living in proximity to whatever you have been working on in here. It requires asking not what you're doing with your life, but what your life is doing to them. 2 witnesses remain. They are going to ask about time. Before the 12th witness enters, the court asks you to sit with something most men prefer to keep at a distance. Think about the things in your life you cannot control. The behavior of other people, the outcomes of your efforts, whether the people you love are safe, whether the things you have built will last, whether the time you have will be enough, whether the losses you have already sustained will be the last losses or only the beginning of them. The court is not asking you to make peace with any of this. It is asking you to look at it directly. Because most men do not look at it directly. They manage it. They keep it at a distance through busyness and planning and the comfortable illusion that sufficient effort produces sufficient control. And the management works up to a point. The 12th witness is going to sit in that chair and say, without apology, that you are going to die. The court asks you to feel, before he enters, what it is like to hold that fact without immediately reaching for something to put between yourself and it, not to dwell, not to despair, simply to look. The 12th witness enters. Chapter 12. The question of mortality. What changes when you remember you will die? The 12th witness enters the courtroom differently than any who came before him. Not with the unsettling intensity of Nietzsche, or the quiet precision of Kant, or the warm sociability of Hume. Marcus Aurelius enters the way a man enters a room when he has already made his peace with most of the things that make other men restless. There is a stillness about him that is not the stillness of a man who has nothing left to feel, but the stillness of a man who has felt everything, and has found through long practice and long discipline a way to carry it without being carried away by it. He was a Roman emperor for 19 years. He commanded armies. He administered an empire of millions. He presided over plague and war and the constant grinding pressure of a world that required more of him than any single human being could reasonably provide. He did all of this while writing, in a private journal never intended for publication, some of the most honest and most searching self-examination in the history of human thought. He sits down in the witness chair and looks at you with the eyes of a man who has thought carefully about exactly one thing more than anything else. He says, "You are going to die." He does not say it to unsettle you. He says it the way a man says something true that most people spend enormous energy avoiding, not to be cruel, but because he has found, through his own long practice, that the avoidance costs more than the acknowledgement. You are going to die. And the question he has come here to ask is what that fact, held honestly and without the various forms of evasion that make it manageable, changes about the way you are living right now. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 of the Common Era in Rome, into a family of Spanish origin that had risen to prominence in Roman society. He was adopted by his predecessor Antoninus Pius at the instruction of the Emperor Hadrian, who had recognized in the young Marcus something that recommended him for the burden of empire. He studied philosophy from an early age, was drawn particularly to Stoicism, and spent his life attempting to live according to its principles in conditions that were almost perfectly designed to make that difficult. He became emperor in 161 and ruled until his death in 180. The years of his reign were marked by war on the northern frontier, by the Antonine Plague, which killed millions across the empire, and by the constant pressure of governance on a scale that would exhaust any person's capacity for equanimity. Through all of it, he wrote in his journal, in Greek, not for posterity, not for instruction, but as a daily practice of self-examination and self-correction, a record of a man trying, imperfectly and honestly, to live according to what he believed. The journal was eventually published under the title Meditations, and it has been read continuously for nearly 2,000 years. What makes it remarkable is not its philosophical originality. The ideas Marcus draws on are largely inherited from earlier Stoic thinkers, particularly Epictetus, the former slave whose discourses shaped Marcus's thinking profoundly. What makes it remarkable is its honesty. It is a record of a man failing and trying again and failing again and trying again, written by someone who had every reason to perform virtue for an audience and who instead chose to speak directly to himself about the gap between who he was and who he was trying to be. That honesty is what he brings into this courtroom. The philosophical tradition Marcus belonged to, Stoicism, had at its center a practice that has come to be known by a Latin phrase that Marcus himself did not use, but that captures something essential about his thinking. Memento mori. Remember that you will die. This was not a counsel of despair. The Stoics were not morbid in the conventional sense. They did not dwell on death because they were pessimistic about life. They dwelt on death because they believed that the regular, honest, unflinching acknowledgement of mortality was one of the most powerful tools available for living well. Most human beings, most of the time, live as though they have unlimited time, not consciously, not as an explicit belief, but in the practical organization of their days, in the things they defer, and the conversations they postpone, and the expressions of love they put off until a better moment, in the way they treat the ordinary Tuesday as a resource to be spent on whatever is most immediately pressing, rather than a genuinely unrepeatable piece of the finite time they have been given. They are operating from an implicit assumption of abundance that the facts do not support. The man who remembers he will die does not operate from that assumption, not because he is anxious about death, not because the awareness of mortality fills him with dread that colors everything else, but because the honest acknowledgement of finitude changes the relationship between a man and his time in a very specific and very useful way. It clarifies, it sorts, it makes suddenly visible the distinction between what actually matters and what merely feels urgent, between the things worth spending the irreplaceable hours of a finite life on and the things that are consuming those hours without deserving them. Marcus wrote, in one form or another, dozens of variations on this theme in his journal. Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what is left and live it properly. How many more mornings will you have? How many more evenings with the people you love? What are you doing with them? He was not asking these questions to produce guilt. He was asking them because he had found in his own experience that the man who asks them honestly tends to reorganize his life in the direction of what he actually values, and the man who does not ask them tends to find, at the end, that he has spent a great deal of his finite time on things that did not, in the end, deserve it. There is a Stoic exercise that Marcus practiced, and that is worth describing here, because it is more demanding and more useful than it first appears. He called it the view from above. The practice of deliberately stepping back from the immediate pressures and preoccupations of daily life and attempting to see them from a wider perspective from the vantage point of a man who is aware of how small any individual human life is in relation to the vast sweep of time and the immensity of the world. Not to feel insignificant, that is not the point, but to feel proportionate, to bring the scale of ordinary human concerns into some relationship with the scale of things that genuinely matter, which tends to produce a useful recalibration of what is worth anxiety and what is worth effort, and what deserves the specific quality of serious attention that only a man with a limited amount of time can afford to give. The argument that seemed catastrophic this morning. The opinion someone holds about you that has been occupying your thoughts. The professional setback that feels in this moment like a defining event in the story of your life. The view from above does not dismiss these things, but it places them in a context that makes their actual weight more visible, which is almost always less than the weight they feel from inside the moment. Marcus was not using this exercise to disengage from life. He was using it to engage more honestly, to strip away the distortions that come from being too close to things, too invested in particular outcomes, too identified with the immediate and the urgent to see clearly what was actually at stake. Marcus wrote something that has stayed with people for nearly 2,000 years, and it is worth sitting with it here in the specific context of this chapter. He wrote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." That sentence is not about dramatic courage in the face of mortality. It is about the specific and common tragedy of the man who defers his genuine life, who keeps it waiting behind the things he tells himself he needs to do first, who is always planning to begin living in some future that keeps receding as he approaches it, until the future is no longer available and the life that was waiting was never actually lived. Most men know some version of this in themselves. The relationship you have been meaning to repair when the time is right. The conversation you have been planning to have when the conditions are better. The version of yourself you have been intending to become when the current demands on your time and energy have subsided enough to make the becoming possible. The thing you have always wanted to do that you have been keeping in the category of someday, which is the category of things that do not actually happen because someday is not a day of the week. Marcus is not asking you to abandon responsibility in the name of self-fulfillment. He was an emperor. He understood obligation better than most people ever will. He is asking whether the life you are living is the one you would choose if you were choosing with the full awareness that the choosing cannot be deferred indefinitely, because it cannot. The Stoics made a distinction that is worth naming explicitly here, because it is one of the most practically useful ideas in the entire philosophical tradition, and one that Marcus returned to constantly in his journal. They distinguished between what is up to us and what is not up to us. What is up to us? Our judgments, our intentions, our responses to what happens, the values we choose to act from, the attention we bring to our lives, the quality of the effort we make in the directions that matter to us. What is not up to us? Everything else. The behavior of other people, the outcomes of our efforts, the health of our bodies beyond a certain point, the length of our lives, the specific circumstances we find ourselves in, the distribution of fortune and misfortune that no amount of virtue or effort can fully determine. The man who confuses these two categories, who spends his energy trying to control what is not up to him and neglects the cultivation of what is a man whose life will be organized around frustration, because the things not up to him will continue to resist his control regardless of the effort he applies, and the things that are up to him will remain undeveloped because he has been directing his energy elsewhere. Marcus was not a passive man. He fought wars. He governed. He made decisions with enormous consequences. But he understood and tried to practice the discipline of distinguishing between the effort that was genuinely his to make and the outcome that was not his to guarantee, and of releasing his grip on the latter in a way that freed his energy for the former. That is a more demanding discipline than it sounds. Before Marcus leaves the witness chair, he opens his journal, not to read from it. He has read from it enough. He opens it and places it on the edge of the witness stand and looks at you and says, "Write your own. Not a philosophical treatise, not a performance of self-examination for an audience, a private record, for yourself alone, of the man you are trying to be and the distance between that man and the one you actually are today. Of the things that matter to you and whether you are spending your time accordingly. Of the people you love and whether you are showing up for them in the ways they deserve. Of the life you have and what you are doing with it, given that it is finite, given that the finiteness is not abstract but specific and personal and closer than it was yesterday. He does not tell you what to write. He says only, the man who examines his life does not waste it. And the man who does not examine it tends to discover, when he no longer has the option of changing course, that he wished he had. He closes the journal. He stands. He looks at you for a moment with the expression of a man who knows something about the weight of a life fully inhabited and the lightness that comes, eventually, from carrying it honestly. And he walks out. The courtroom is very quiet. There is one witness left, and the chair he will occupy is the one you have been sitting in since the beginning. Chapter 13. The question of legacy. What remains after you are gone? The 13th witness chair holds two men. Marcus Aurelius has returned. He was here in the previous chapter, asking about mortality, about the view from above, about the discipline of distinguishing between what is yours to control and what is not. He returns now because the question of legacy is inseparable from the question of mortality, because what a man leaves behind is shaped entirely by how he chose to live, and because Marcus understood from the specific vantage point of a man who knew his name would outlast him, that legacy is not something you build deliberately. It is something you reveal through the accumulated choices of a lifetime, whether you intended to reveal it or not. Aristotle is beside him again. He has appeared twice before in this courtroom, once to ask about character and once to ask about love, and he returns here because he believed that the question of what a man leaves behind was not separate from the question of what a man is. That legacy, in its truest sense, was not the monuments or the accomplishments or the things that bore a man's name after he was gone. It was the specific quality of the lives that had been touched by his, and whether those lives were better or worse, more fully themselves or less, because of the contact. They sit together in the witness chair and look at you with the particular patience of men who have thought carefully about endings. They ask, in the way two men with different angles on the same truth ask a question, what will remain after you are gone? Not what you hope will remain, not what you intend to leave. What will actually be there in the lives of the people who knew you, in the specific ways they move through the world after you are no longer in it, that would not have been there if you had never existed. That question is harder than it first appears. Marcus speaks first, because he has been thinking about this longer than most. He wrote in his journal about impermanence, with a frequency and a directness that can feel, at first reading, almost relentless. He listed the names of emperors and philosophers and conquerors who had been, in their time, the most powerful and most celebrated men in the world, and he noted that most of them were now forgotten, that their names survived only in the histories that a diminishing number of people read, that the empires they had built had crumbled, and the reputations they had cultivated had dissolved, and the specific quality of their presence in the world had become, over time, indistinguishable from absence. He did not write these passages to produce despair. He wrote them as a corrective to the specific human tendency to treat reputation and achievement, and the accumulation of external recognition as though they were the substance of a life rather than its shadow, because they are the shadow. The substance, in Marcus's view, was something else entirely. It was the specific quality of the man himself, the character he had built through the practice of virtue, the way he had treated the people around him in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life, the specific presence he had been to the people who loved him and the people who depended on him, and the people who simply encountered him in the course of a day. That is what persists. Not in history books, not in monuments or institutions bearing a man's name. In the people he shaped, in the habits of thought and feeling and action that he modeled for the people who were watching, and that those people carried forward into their own lives, and that shaped in turn the people they touched, in the long, unrecorded, largely invisible chain of influence that is the actual mechanism by which a human life extends itself beyond its own ending. Marcus would ask you to consider what you are passing on through that mechanism, not what you intend to pass on, not the values you talk about or the lessons you consciously try to teach, what you are actually transmitting through the specific way you live, through what you demonstrate rather than what you declare, through the model of manhood that the people closest to you are absorbing whether you are aware of giving it or not. Because that is the legacy that is actually being built, right now, in the ordinary moments of today. Aristotle speaks next, and he brings to the question the same concrete precision he brought to everything. He had a concept that is relevant here, which he called energeia, usually translated as actuality or activity, the condition of a thing that is fully expressing its own nature, fully doing what it is essentially for. A knife that cuts well is in a state of energeia. A musician who plays with full command of their instrument is in a state of energeia. A human being who is living in accordance with their highest capacities, who is fully expressing through their choices and their relationships and their work the specific kind of excellence that is available to them, is in a state of energeia. And Aristotle believed that the legacy a man leaves is in the deepest sense the record of how much time he spent in that state. Not the record of his accomplishments, which are the products of his activity, but not the activity itself. Not the record of his reputation, which is other people's assessment of his activity, but not the thing itself. The record, legible in the lives of the people he touched, of how fully he was actually living the life available to him, how completely he was expressing whatever was genuinely good in him, how present he was to the specific opportunities for virtue and connection and genuine contribution that his particular life offered. That record is not written in marble. It is written in the character of his children, who learned what a man is by watching him, in the specific way his friends think about themselves and about the world, which was shaped in part by the quality of his attention to them over years of genuine friendship. In the people he mentored, who carry forward some portion of what he gave them without always being able to trace exactly where it came from. In the communities he was part of, which are slightly different because he was in them, in ways that are difficult to measure but that are real. Aristotle would ask you to think about the specific people whose lives are going to be different because you were in them, not the people who will remember you. Memory is not the same as influence, and influence is not the same as legacy in the sense Aristotle means. He means the people who are going to be more fully themselves, more capable of the specific kind of human flourishing that is available to them because of the particular way you were present to them. That is the question, not how you will be remembered, how you will have mattered. The most significant legacy is not the professional one, not the things a man accomplished in his work, the contributions he made to his field or his institution or the specific projects he was part of. Those things matter and they are real, but they tend to be the legacy that gets the most attention because they are the most visible and the most easily measured, and the visibility and the measurability create an illusion that they are the most significant. The most significant legacy is the relational one, the specific quality of the man you were to the people who were closest to you, what it was like to be your child, what it was like to be your partner, what it was like to be your closest friend, what it felt like, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary week, to be in your presence, to be on the receiving end of your attention and your care and your particular way of being in the world. That legacy is being built right now, in ways that are invisible precisely because they are so ordinary. The father who is fully present to his children in the unremarkable exchanges of daily life, who listens when they speak about things that seem small, who shows up with genuine attention rather than distracted proximity, who models through his daily behavior what it looks like to take one's responsibilities seriously without losing one's humanity in the process. That father is building a legacy that will outlast anything he accomplishes professionally by generations. Because what children carry forward from their parents is not primarily the lessons they were explicitly taught. It is the model they were shown. The template that was demonstrated so consistently and so early that it became part of how they understand what a human life looks like, and what a man is, and how a person treats the people they love. That template is your legacy, whether you attend to it or not. The question is whether you are building it deliberately or by default. Both men share a concern that belongs here, which is the specific danger of the man who defers the work of genuine living until some future moment when the conditions are more favorable. Marcus wrote about the man who tells himself that his real life will begin when the current pressures have passed, when the work is done, when the children are grown, when the financial situation is more secure, when the circumstances finally align in the way they never quite do, because circumstances are always in the process of aligning and never quite finished aligning. That man is building a legacy of deferral. He is modeling, for the people who are watching him, a relationship to life in which the actual living is always just around the corner, always contingent on conditions being met, always held in reserve against a future that remains perpetually just out of reach. Aristotle would say that the man who spends his life in preparation for living, who treats the actual days of his actual life as the price he pays for a future that will somehow be more real and more worthy of his full engagement, is a man who is not in a state of energia. He is a man whose capacities are not being expressed, whose particular form of human excellence is not being practiced, whose legacy, as a result, is the legacy of a man who was always about to begin. Both men would say the same thing in response. Begin now, not when the conditions are better, not when you are more ready, not when the demands on your time have subsided or the specific difficulties of your current situation have resolved. Now, in the life you actually have, with the people who are actually in it, using the capacities that are actually available to you, in the direction of what you actually value. The legacy is being built right now. The only question is what kind. The man who has examined his life, who has done the honest and uncomfortable work of looking at what he is and what he carries and what he has been avoiding, who has developed some genuine knowledge of himself and some genuine honesty about the gap between who he is and who he is trying to be, that man is not building a legacy he will have to be ashamed of. Not because the examined man is perfect, he is not. Not because the examined man does not make mistakes or cause harm or fail the people he loves in ways that he will regret. He does. But because the examined man tends to catch himself sooner, tends to course correct more honestly, tends to be more genuinely present to the people around him because he is not spending enormous energy managing what he has refused to look at. Tends to love better because he is more capable of seeing clearly. The legacy of the examined man is not a monument. It is a quality of presence, a way of having been in the world that the people who knew him carry forward in the specific ways they learned to pay attention, to take responsibility, to show up honestly for the people they love. That legacy does not require fame. It does not require accomplishment in any conventional sense. It requires only the ongoing, imperfect, honest practice of being as fully and as genuinely yourself as you are capable of being in the specific life you have been given for as long as you have to live it. Marcus closes his journal one more time. Aristotle straightens in his chair with the particular composure of a man who has said what he came to say and is satisfied that it was worth saying. They look at you together for a moment. Then Marcus says, in the tone he uses in his journal when he is speaking to himself most directly, "You are not yet done. Whatever you have not yet done, you are not yet done. The work of becoming is not finished until the life is finished, and the life is not finished yet." They stand together. They walk out of the courtroom side by side. The room is very still. The witness chair is empty, and it is waiting for the only witness who has not yet spoken. Chapter 14. The Final Witness. Who are you becoming? The witness chair is empty. You have been sitting in the gallery of this courtroom since the beginning, watching witness after witness take that chair, listening to the questions they carried, feeling the specific weight of the ones that landed closest to the truth of your own life. You have been the reader, the observer, the man the questions were addressed to, but not the man who was required to answer them out loud. That changes now. The judge looks at you, not with the expression he has worn throughout the proceedings, the patient, attentive, evaluative expression of a man who is listening carefully to testimony. He looks at you with something different, something that is not quite an invitation and not quite a requirement, and is perhaps both at once. He says, "The witness chair is yours." You sit down. The courtroom is quiet in a way it has not been quiet before. The previous silences were the silences between testimony, the pauses that follow one witness leaving and precede the next arriving. This silence is different. This is the silence of a space waiting to be filled by the only voice that has not yet spoken, yours. There are no philosophers here now, no witnesses from across centuries and traditions, no one to carry the question for you or frame it in terms that allow you to engage with it at a slight remove, as the ideas of someone else, interesting and relevant and perhaps applicable to your life, but not yet fully and uncomfortably your own. There is only you and the questions and the specific life that is yours and no one else's. The first question is the one Socrates asked, reframed for the specific life you are living. What do you believe that you have not examined? Not as a philosophical exercise, as a specific, personal, honest accounting. The belief you have been carrying about why your life looks the way it looks that you have defended rather than examined. The story about the most significant loss of your life that contains your version of events, but not necessarily all the versions that are true. The certainty you carry about someone who hurt you or someone you hurt that has been serving a purpose you have not fully admitted to yourself. What is it? You do not have to say it aloud. This courtroom has no requirement of public confession, but you do have to look at it, because the whole of what this courtroom has been asking you to look honestly at the specific life you are actually living rather than the version of it that is most comfortable to carry. And the looking has to start somewhere. It starts here. The second question is the one Plato asked, made personal and immediate. What are you still watching as shadows? Which of the narratives that govern your closest relationships are shadows on a wall rather than the reality itself? The story you tell about your father that was assembled when you were young enough to need it to be simpler than the full truth. The story about your marriage or your most significant failed relationship that places responsibility in the way it is most comfortable to place it. The ideal you carry about how your life should look that is preventing you from being fully present to the life you actually have. What would you see if you turned around? You know the answer to that question, or you know the direction the answer is in. The shadow work that this courtroom has been asking for is not a mystery. It does not require information you do not have. It requires honesty about information you have been carrying for years. The third question belongs to all the witnesses together, and it is the one this courtroom was built around from the beginning. Who are you becoming? Not who you are, not who you have been. Not the fixed and finished product of everything that has happened to you and everything you have done and every choice you have made up until this moment. Who are you in the process of becoming, in the choices you are making now and will make tomorrow and the day after, in the direction you are pointing yourself with the specific and finite time you have left? That question does not have a single answer. It does not resolve into a conclusion you reach once and carry forward as settled. It is a living question, a question that has to be asked again tomorrow and the day after, in the specific circumstances of the specific life you are living, with the specific people who are in it. The examined man asks it regularly, not obsessively, not with the anxious self-scrutiny of a man who cannot be present to his own life because he is always evaluating it, but with the honest, grounded, returning attention of a man who knows that becoming is not a thing that happens to you. It is a thing you participate in, deliberately or by default, and the quality of your participation determines the quality of the man you are in the process of becoming. You cannot love well what you do not see clearly. You cannot see clearly what you have not examined. And you cannot examine what you are afraid to find. The examined life is not a withdrawal from the world. It is the condition under which genuine engagement with the world becomes possible. You are not done. Whatever has been unfinished, it is not yet too late to attend to it. Whatever has been avoided, the avoidance can end today. Whatever has been deferred in the expectation of better conditions, the conditions that are present right now are the ones you have, and they are sufficient. The man you are becoming is being built from this moment forward, in the choices available to you today, with the people who are in your life right now. That is not a small thing. That is everything. The judge looks at you one final time. He does not render a verdict. This court never renders verdicts. That is not what this court is for. He says only what he said at the very beginning, in the words that open these proceedings, and that means something different now than they did then. This court exists for one purpose: to determine who you are becoming. The determination is yours to make. He closes the proceedings, the court adjourns. Because the trial continues every day, a man remains alive. The court therefore remands this case to the remainder of your life. The evidence will continue to accumulate. The questions will present themselves again in different forms and at unexpected moments, in the ordinary circumstances of an ordinary day, in the quality of a silence between you and someone you love, in the specific feeling that arrives when you have done something that does not quite align with the man you are trying to become. Those moments are not verdicts. They are continuations of these proceedings. The court instructs you to attend to them. Epilogue. A note from the author. The trial continues. I did not write this book from a distance. I wrote it from the inside of a life that has required, more than once, the kind of honest examination these pages are asking of you. I have sat with the questions Socrates asked and found them uncomfortable in the specific way that questions are uncomfortable when they are pointing at something true. I have recognized myself in Plato's cave, in Nietzsche's inherited template, in Jung's shadow, in the particular evasions that Kierkegaard describes so precisely, that reading him sometimes feels less like philosophy and more like being found out. I am not a finished man. I do not offer this book as the work of someone who has arrived at the other side of all of it. I offer it as the work of a man who has been paying attention for a long time to what it costs a person to live without examination and what becomes possible when he chooses otherwise. Most of what I write about lives in the space after the crisis has passed, when the noise fades, when the audience is gone, when the real work begins. That is the territory I have spent my career in, through years of work in addiction recovery, emotional regulation, and domestic violence intervention. I have watched men at the moment when the structures that were holding a life together have failed, and I have watched what happens next. Not the breakthrough, not the dramatic turning point that makes for a clean story, but the patient, private effort that follows. The work that does not seek applause because there is no one watching. The slow, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of a man who has decided to face himself without illusion. That work is what this book is about. At the center of everything I write are moments of reckoning. Times when a person sees themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time, and must choose whether to turn away from what they find or move through it. Those moments are not always dramatic. They are often quiet. They happen in the privacy of a man's own thinking, in the ordinary circumstances of an ordinary day, in the specific silence that follows a question that has finally been asked honestly enough to require an honest answer. Those moments are where the change lives. This book is, among other things, an attempt to offer that practice a philosophical foundation. To show that the questions a man must ask of himself in a genuine moment of reckoning are the same questions that the greatest thinkers in human history spent their lives examining. That the examined life Socrates described is not an academic concept. It is the specific, practical, daily work of a man who has decided that the version of himself he has been living inside is worth looking at honestly, and that what he finds there, however uncomfortable, is something he can do something about. I believe that, not as a position, but as something I have watched be true in the lives of men who were willing and in the lives of men who were not. The difference between those two groups is not intelligence or circumstance or the specific weight of what they were carrying. It is the willingness to sit in the witness chair. Dr. Rick Novak.